Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 4 of your spring school. My name is Sarrah Kassem. I'm going to be chairing this session. I'm a postdoc fellow here at the Scuola working on intersectional labor. And that's why I'm very happy to see that we're going in the direction of centering labor. We're going to start with a presentation, a lecture by Professor Guglielmo Meardi, which I guess you all know at this stage. He's a professor of sociology of work and our current dean, and he will be discussing labor studies today. We're going to have the presentation part be until around 11. And then we will move on to our discussion, both with Lucia Amorosi, who is currently a postdoc researcher at the University of Trento, and then also with Iraklis Dimitriadis, who is an assistant professor at the school here. And on that note, the floor is yours, Guglielmo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarrah, and looking forward to have a nice discussion. Can you hear me if I stand? Because, you know, labor power, the first thing is to stand up. Hear me? I will speak about standing up. So why labor power? Well, it's a big fashion of the last few years to talk about power. It's very welcome because some previous approaches in the 90s and so on had not looked at power, and I think that was a big hole in the understanding of what was going on, and placing power back into the political economy is crucial. But with all fashions, the fact that an idea is used a lot means also there is a little bit of confusion. People use it in different ways. So today I'll try, from my point of view, to explain where it comes from, this idea of power, resources, and labor relations, how it has been used, possible criticism, which I will address. Some of them have already been raised in these 3 days, previous 3 days, and some open questions for debate. So I'm looking forward also for the discussion which will follow with colleagues and with everybody. Now, before this fashion for power resources in labor studies emerged about 5-6 years ago, power was already sometimes used in traditional industrial relations with some relatively simple indicators. Usually that was union density. Union density is calculated as the number of members trade unions have as a proportion of the eligible workforce. So the workers who have the right to join trade unions. There are some people who don't have the right to join the trade unions. Some countries, the police cannot join the trade unions. Informal workers. They can join personally, but they're not calculated because they're not considered as eligible workforce. And there is some reason for looking at union density because there is some association with quite a few outliers, important outliers, between union density and some important things that happen in societies, such as the welfare state development or working conditions such as health and safety. So it's not irrelevant, but it is very imprecise because the outliers are very big and very important. The most famous one is France, extremely low union density, only 7% of French workers are members of trade unions, but they are at the top of the international table in terms of social expenditure. They have relatively good health and safety, and so on and so forth. So it is not precise, and it is very formal, okay? Union density. Yesterday, we had the lecture with Sarrah, and he had to start with the point that, well, if we consider Asia rather than Europe, we have to give up some of the assumptions that there is only one way to regulate the labor market. And we discussed this in depth with Sarrah. Clearly, many countries, union density, formal trade unions, informal employment are not the right things to look at. And then we had Maurizio Zeni in the afternoon say, well, there's a fetishism, actually, we should stop assuming that trade unions are workers, trade unions are the labor. Other looks at strikes, okay? So powerful labor movements are those who organize strikes. Here, the problem is even bigger. This has been used by important people, including Lucia and Chris Howell is one of the main indicators when they talk about the rise of neoliberalism is the fall of strikes. I think they have a point. The fall of strikes shows that trade unions have been found increasingly difficult to protest against what was going on. But if we look at both times and space, the fact that there is a strike may mean anything. It may mean that workers are strong. It may as well mean that workers are desperate, okay? So it's not an indicator of labor power. And actually, probably there is a sort of U curve between the amount of strikes and labor power. This is what all the institutionalization of conflict theory shows. You have a lot of strikes where workers are very weak or where are extremely strong, but in the middle, there are less. And also, the more you have an institutionalized system of industrial relations where the two sides know each other, they can predict the effect of strikes. The trade unions doesn't need to go on strike very much. It's enough to threaten they will go on strike, and the employers will more or less know whether the strike will be successful or not, and will make concessions relatively quickly rather than waste months and months in discussion and fights and so on and so forth. So what does it mean for labor power? It depends. I mean, is the institutionalization good or not? The number of strikes doesn't tell us anything. Sarosh Guruvilla, who we had yesterday, tried to put the things together. So by looking especially at collective bargaining, that was more than 20 years ago. Where there's union influence indicator, the centralization of collective bargaining, which means the influence of labor on the socioeconomic system, the capacity to control the labor market and the product market as a whole. So not just one victor in one place, but make sure that all employers will play the game, that no other companies will undercut the win of some workers in one place. So that is very, very important. And the coverage of collective bargaining to make sure that there are no spaces outside of control of the trade unions. Again, we know, unfortunately, collective bargaining is in decline, not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of quality. We discussed that 2 days ago in the session about wages. So the fact that we have collective bargaining centralized and high coverage doesn't necessarily mean that things are getting better for workers. So in the debate, it is put a bit as a tension between the logic of membership and the logic of influence. When we think about strong trade unions, we mean that trade unions have a lot of people who are happy to protest and follow the union leaders and participate and so on, or we are thinking about the trade unions and manage to affect important economic and social and political decisions, which is something a little bit different. And sometimes there's a tension between the two, okay? Trade union can achieve something with employers, have an effect, change some regulations, change the terms of conditional employment, but have a little less support from the membership. Sometimes they have a lot of support from the membership, but they don't manage to get a result. So the tension between the two, whether we're looking at one or the other, is always there. Now, just to tell you, for those who don't study this, obviously, with all these traditional indicators of industrial relations, the news are not good. With a couple of little exceptions, which is very interesting to discuss, whether people from Belgium or Switzerland or some other places in general. If we look at the advanced industrialized world, the countries which are in the OECD, in 40 years, union density has fallen by 50%, collective bargaining coverage has fallen by 33%, strike volumes have fallen 20-fold, okay, in terms of days lost in strike per 1,000 workers, 20 times less than it was in the early 80s. It doesn't mean that people are happy. It doesn't mean that people don't protest anymore, but certainly those traditional indicators would tell a story that is clearly negative. For a few years, you can say, oh, maybe it is a little wave. A lot of theories have been suggested by Philip Schmitter or John Kelly. Oh, it's a wave, don't worry, the wave will come back. It's Polanyi, you know, the swing in one side, and then will come back on this other side. All this, you know, wishful thinking that there is some sort of mechanical logic and things will get better if things don't get well. It is only for a short time. Now it has been 40 years, and more or less the picture on that kind of industrial relation is quite clear. Now, here let's enter power resource theory. Power resource theory is not new. It was suggested, initially formulated by Walter Korpi, an important Swedish sociologist who died November 2024. He died quite recently. He was quite active until the very end of his life. He was more than 90, I think, when he died. And has come back in the last couple of years. Now, what was Walter Korpi interested in? Walter Korpi had worked, I think it had worked for an institute for the army, for the Swedish army, something like that. But then he worked for quite a long time for the trade unions. He was a trade union expert. And he was interested in the fact that in Sweden, trade unions and workers had kept improving their situation quite systematically until the 70s, but there was no one clear single indicator that would show, well, that is the reason why things are getting better. They had been getting better since the 30s. Sometimes there were a lot of strikes. Sometimes there were not very lot of strikes. Sometimes there was high unemployment. Sometimes there was low unemployment. And so he came with the idea that what matters in the balance of power between employers and workers is the power resources that the people have, that the two actors have. And the resources are something that you can explicitly use, or also just let the other side know that you have those resources, and in case you can use them, okay? And that would mean that the fact that the trade unions in Sweden had organized big strikes in the 20s had become a power resources afterwards, when they did not need anymore to organize strikes, because they had managed to institutionalize that strength and turn it into something else that employers, Swedish employers, knew. And that was a broader picture of power, which included the strength of trade unions, the capacity to organize strikes because they had a huge strike fund. And if you have a strike fund, the employer knows that people, if they start a strike, they can stay on strike for a long time. Otherwise, if you have been on strike, you know, when you strike, you don't get any money. So if you're a worker, a couple of days is fine. After a few days, well, you don't have food to put on the table, you can't pay your mortgage or whatever else. But if the union has accumulated strike funds because it has a lot of members that pay fees, and part of the fees you keep it for a strike fund. You don't go on strike every day, so the strike fund accumulates rather than being depleted. Well, that is a power resource, clearly. You can use it. But there is also something else. The fact that there was a big social democratic party that came to power in the 1930s, which had a very strong not monopoly of power, because Sweden was a democracy, and a couple of times the Conservatives also won the election, but most of the time the Social Democratic Party was there and was likely to be in power, and the Social Democratic Party was also strong in telling employers, well, if you don't come to a deal with the trade unions on the other side of the Baltic Sea, there is Russia, and that is what might happen in the future. And the employers, the Swedish employers, accepted to sit in a little island of Stockholm in 1932 with the trade unions, and they stayed there on the little island until they signed these big basic agreements. And that basic agreements became an institution that somehow in itself perpetuated that strength. So that even if unemployment went a little bit up and down, that a form of power could become another one. So basically, power resource theory. Corp initially thought about theory because he wanted to explain something. So he had this theoretical ambition. I would say that the way the power resources are used nowadays is generally called as an approach or a perspective, because the theoretical ambition is much lower. It's not to make a very clear prediction one thing leads to another. And the focus was on collective power, okay? Collective power consolidated in institutions. So not just the moment in strike, but an institutionalization of a big strike in the 1920s, which you turn into power resource you can use over time. What matters is the resource and not the power exercise. So it did not matter whether people went on strike on a certain year or not. It was the fact they had the resource, and the other side knew the unions had the resource in case to go on on strike. Thus, the definition in the 1985 book is the attributes, capacities, or means of actors, individuals, or collectivities which enable them to reward or to punish other actors, okay? There is a little bit of Max Weber in this, but it's more specific about two actors. It's a very class-based framework. There are only two actors here, the workers and capital. In principle, under capitalism, if you look at the cover of his first book, it's clear that the power is in the hands of the employers, but because the workers are many, they can turn their numbers into a power resource that can face the big economic power of capital. Then power resources can also be multiplied by mobilization. But this is not the mobilization, the resource mobilization approach that exists in social movement studies in the United States. The mobilization is something that may happen, may not happen. It's more the area of strategy. Power resource approach is a structural approach that tries to show what matters in the definition of who is powerful and who is not powerful. So it's another level of analysis. The mobilization is more proximate. It's more what happens here, a specific place in a specific area. Power resources is what is behind the use of power. And that was important for Corp. It was very empirical when he was at trade union, the trade union metal workers research center. He had to collect data all the time. He knew that power was important, and power, you don't meet it in the street. Power is a concept, an abstract concept. And generally, if we look at discussion about powers in politics, it's always an ex post discussion. So once something had happened, you see somebody won, somebody lost, you say, well, the one who won was powerful. Thank you very much. That's obvious. But that is not of any use to trade unions who have to decide whether to start a struggle or not before they know the outcome. Okay, in order to know what to do, you need to have something to measure, which is not power itself, which is too abstract, and it's not something you can count, touch in the street. Power resources, the good thing is that it was something, in his view, you can actually measure. So if you have a good analysis, you know how powerful you are, and then you can choose the strategy, whether to fight or not, when knowing what the result could be. It doesn't mean automatically there is only one strategy that comes for your analysis of power resources, but at least you take an informed decision. That you are taking a fight that probably will not achieve something, but maybe it has something else, or you're starting a fight that actually will lead to a labor victory. So the empirically observable resources for Corpi were the electoral strengths, that is the fact that the working class was voting for a specific party, compared to the electoral strengths of the bourgeoisie. So in some countries, the bourgeoisie was very well organized and had a strong united front, while workers were divided between conservative, socialist, communists, and so on and so forth. In Sweden, the workers were united and the bourgeoisie was divided. So there was a clear, measurable strength of the working class. The mobilization power, that is the capacity to organize strikes, which means having a lot of members, having a history of successful strikes in the past, having a strike fund, all things that you can measure. there was the power in the labor market. That was an important part of the story. That is the balance between, usually actually Corpi was just talking about unemployment. If unemployment is high, obviously workers are weaker. If unemployment is low, workers are strong because they cannot be threatened. Let's say they cannot, they have alternative if they lose their job. Maybe the better way to put it is the ratio between job vacancies and the unemployed. And also there was the skills and human capital, whether workers were easily replaceable mutually, or whether workers had managed to organize in sectors with specific skills, specific vocational training, and therefore it was more difficult for employers to fire a worker and get another one from somewhere else. All things you can somehow measure. It had important implications, this approach at the time. First, it launched one stream and approach in the study of the welfare state, which was class-based and contrasted with other views of the welfare state that prioritized in the explanation either the employers or the state, either what was in the interest of Bismarck or what was in the interest of large corporations. They wanted to have a predictable, quiet workforce. For Corpi and Esping-Andersen, the beginning of Esping-Andersen, the welfare state is a function of the strengths of the working class. Occasionally, there are good employers who want the welfare state. Occasionally, there is a conservative politician that say, well, yeah, let's give in the welfare state. But in general, neither politicians nor employers want the welfare state. It's much more likely that they resist it, and a good, strong welfare state only comes from the strengths and the power resources of labor. The other one, which came a little bit later, parallel, was trying to link labor power with democratization. And that wave was in the early 90s, when there was the so-called, I think there was the third wave of democratization in Latin America and Eastern Europe. And they tried to say, well, unlike some traditional political science, it's not the bourgeoisie, it's not the middle class that want democracy, it's the largest group in society, which is the working class. And therefore, there is a link between the strengths of workers and democracy. That idea in the 90s nowadays works a little bit less, I think. So let's stop Corpi. That is the one theory. Then there is another one, a very influential article by Eric Olin Wright, neo-Marxist sociologist, also died a couple of years ago, I think 4 years, who only mentions actually Corpi and Esping-Andersen once. So it doesn't, really want to acknowledge his debt to Corpi and Esping-Andersen, who tries to explain a thing that for Marxists is always a little bit difficult, that is class compromise, okay? Eric Olin Wright is a neo-Marxist. He has a clear roots in the materialist analysis, in a class-based view of the world. However, the neo is quite important for him. So his class, if you look at his stratification theory, his class model is not 2 classes. He's aware the world is a little bit more complicated than that. Is a 12 classes system. 12 is already more complicated, more difficult to put it on a political leaflets. Okay, 2 classes quite easy. We have the workers against the bosses. 12 is already a little bit more complicated. And he's also neo-Marxist in the sense that 150 years after Marx, he acknowledged that the revolution is not exactly around the corner as Marx was writing in the 1850s, when he said the crisis is here and it's the end of capitalism. Well, no, not yet. As I try to understand why there were compromises between workers and employers by looking at power between the two. And his idea was that not all in labor power is bad for capitalists. Some of it, having workers feeling well treated, can be also an aspect of efficiency, okay? Not only that, if workers have some more money than just the reproduction of their labor power as traditional original labor Marxist theory says, well, that is also not too bad for the economy, because they will be confident consumer, they will be buying more things, the usual were sentenced by Ford. You know, they need to buy the cars, so let's give them $5 an hour. So his idea is to distinguish two forms of power: the association, which is the strength of trade unions mostly, and the structural power, that is two things: in the market, having relatively low unemployment and being you know, quite difficult to replace, but also having a role in the demand, the aggregate demand in the economy. Okay? That is something which is now taken up by the growth models approach, which was mentioned by Bruno Mable on Monday, if you remember. And also in production. The power in production means having skills. That means you have some knowledge that actually the employer doesn't have. Or they have it, but they cannot turn it into practice. They know in theory how to use the machine, but they can't actually personally do it. They can't easily find other people who do that. So those areas in the market and production explain the structure of power. Association is more in politics. And in politics is also very important because by then there was democracy, parliamentary democracy, unlike at the time of Marx. And employers' capital knew that if workers are united, they have the majority, they get a government that makes the interest of workers and not the interest of capital. And that is a very strong argument to get a good deal, okay? So what it means is that the increase, if you look, you can see and read the chart, but it's quite famous, and it's in the article of 2000 in the American Sociological Review. With the increase of working class power, which is the lower curve, the interest of capital are reduced at the beginning, okay? The ideal situation for capital is to have all the power in their hand, like in the picture or in Corpus' book. But if workers accumulate power, for a while the interest of capital loses. So everything that is gained by workers is lost by the employers. But after a while, you get a situation where a compromise can be achieved because the increase in power of workers can also be good for the employers because they get political stability, because they get a good market, mass consumption, because they get very efficient workers, because they're motivated, they don't protest, and they invest in their own skills, they're loyal to the company, and whatever else. That doesn't mean that Eric Olin Wright has become a social democrat and has sold out on his Marxism, because the model goes further. And if workers manage to increase their power even more, that at that point of social compromise, then the problems with capitalism starts. That is, if workers are not just happy to be treated relatively well in the workplace and in politics, they want even more power, some economic decision, for instance, and so on, then the problems with capitalism start, and then obviously the profits will fall. And therefore the two curves depart. And if labor power manages to go over the point of compromise, eventually, well, they will take control, and their interest will be met, and the interest of capital will not be met. Okay. Now, interesting point here is that this division between the three spheres. I think that is the most important contribution by Eric Olin Wright. That is the fact that in politics, in the market, in production, in some situation, which is the Swedish situation, you can have the conditions for a compromise. But if worker power goes even further, then those conditions are no longer met. And therefore you have a counter mobilization of capital, which is what happened in Sweden in the late 70s. Until the 70s, they were quite happy to play the game. In the late 70s, they started to say, well, it's not, it's too much, especially when the trade unions started with a program of giving wage increases, not in money anymore, but in shares of companies, which will have led in a relatively short amount of time to the socialization of the means of production. So further elaboration after that. There is an explanation of globalization in this Eric Collier White's paper, just quickly, the fact that under globalization, all these three conditions for class compromise disappear because in politics, national governments don't have any power anymore because they have to do what multinationals want, because the market is not anymore the national market, but the exports, so you don't care about paying your workers well, and because maybe in production, you can still have power by workers, but obviously that will be only in some workplaces, and therefore it will be more difficult to have a political expression for it. There are other elaborations, very important. Beverly Silver, who was here as a Champi visitor last year, who tried to push this kind of analysis to the global level rather than just the European or Swedish one, distinguishing also between the Marxian kind of power based on workers who know about their power in production and therefore want to increase their power, their decision power in the economy, and the more Polanyian labor movement, they want to defend their community. They're more defensive, they more look at the past. They want to defend their natural resources, their environment, their communities, their culture, and so on. And she said that with the change in capitalism in 2003, there will be a shift of structural labor power towards the south of the world. You have more Marxian labor movements in the south and more Polanyian defensive ones in the north of the world. And then there's been this big wave in the last 10 years of searching for more detailed kinds of power resources. Smuts and Dörre, Levesque and Murray, Restaurant and Arnold's, and so on. Now, this is what I'm trying to focus on, try to make sense of this. Now, a part of this, a part of the new wave of publications on power resources falls into a kind of empiricist taxonomy exercise. So there's something that happens in many kind of studies. In the welfare state literature, people try to find a new kind of welfare state in addition to the three ones of Esping-Andersen. In the varieties of capitalism, there are those who try to find, oh, I found a new variety of capitalism, a country in Africa which is neither like Germany nor like the US. Big surprise. So we have a new kind of capitalism, and so on and so forth. And the same with power resources. If you look around, you find something new that people had not done or not observed before, which is nice. You know, it's always a contribution to knowledge, but it's not a particularly theoretical innovation because it doesn't say much more about what really matters for the outcome of the class struggle. And some, like Michael Borroway, another important sociologist who died last year, sometimes these arguments that start with the Polanyian arguments, they fall into what he calls Pollyanna. Pollyanna, for those who are not, they did not read children's literature for 100 years ago. Pollyanna is a character in the children's literature in America of a young girl who is naively optimistic. Things go badly, but she's always happy. She always thinks it's always good. And there is a little bit of this in labor studies, okay? That, okay, things are not very good at the big picture. But if you look around with the magnifying glass, we find a worker victory and we can feel a little bit better. That had already happened with the union revitalization literature 15, 20 years before, which started as a theoretical innovation to say that if unions change, then they will get power again. It ended up just by looking for smaller and smaller cases in which unions had managed to do something. And there are obviously a lot of cases in which unions managed to do something, but they didn't, without the capacity to generalizing in a broader theoretical argument. But the outcomes of, at the moment, with this big cottage industry of power resource approach, has been to focus on 4/5 kind of resources. This is now called mostly an approach and a perspective because the theoretical argument is not that clear. But the four main kinds are the structural one, which is divided, as from Eric Collier White, between the marketplace, economic power, and the workplace, the organizational power. Some people say it's you are putting together two things which are very, very different, both politically and sociologically. But let's leave this a little bit aside. There are some examples and new implications and new insights in this. For instance, I would mention Alberto Sacchetto's book last year, 2 years ago, about collective mobility power. The fact that in globalization, workers also have power if they organize as mobile. And that is specifically important for migrant workers, who in theory are terribly weak, but if they share information about where the best opportunities are, they actually manage to make some gain. Then there's the associational power, which is union membership, but we are more and more aware it's not just union density, it's the activism of the members, where the members are actually ready to do something about the trade unions. It's about the strike funds, and it's about the horizontal organization. Many have mentioned that. In some places, with the big changes there are nowadays in the economy, with the platform industry, with new forms of work, and the traditional sectors becoming less important, what matters is whether a trade unions work as association not only of professions, but also of communities. And some trade unions have this tradition, especially the Italian and the French ones, of horizontal organizations. Then there is institutional resources, which are the political one, that is having a strong social democratic party or a government that sits down with the trade unions or recognizes them. The legal ones, which are very important, that is the fact that workers have achieved workplace rights, maybe even some co-determination, or at least the rights to organize in the factory and to have elections and to have strikes. As Sarrah was saying yesterday, in the US, you can be fired very, very easily if you're a union member. That obviously makes a huge difference in what trade unions can achieve or not. And the collective goods, that is welfare state and services, which make workers less dependent on the daily wage to survive if they have achieved some social protection like unemployment insurance, for instance, which is a very important institutional resource for trade unions. And then there is all this area which is more complicated. For some it is one, for some it's two, for some it's three kind of resources. That is the societal one. That is things that workers have not in their own organizations, not in specific official institutions, but somehow in society. And the two big ideas here are the ideologies, the ideational resources. If we look at surveys, we see that the popularity of trade unions varies country by country. Italy, unfortunately, is a country where the popularity of trade unions has fallen quite a lot. And therefore, their capacity to be assertive is somehow undermined by the fact that some other ideologies have become stronger. There is quite a lot of studies about the United Kingdom, where trade unions were quite active and mobilized in the 60s and the 70s, and then there was the big backlash from Margaret Thatcher. It's not that Margaret Thatcher had better ideas than the trade unions, which actually were very active in economic elaborations in the 70s, but somehow Margaret Thatcher managed to put ideas very, very simply. If you don't have a job, get on your bike and find another one, and the cause of all economic ills are strikes. Okay, very, very simple. It's not even true, but it is so easy that it helped explain why Margaret Thatcher managed to get a big inroad in votes in the working class and managed to be in power for about 10 years. Her ideas then proved wrong, but at the time, the fact of an ideology that becomes somehow popular or even hegemonic in a society is a power resource that can be used for or against the trade unions. On their side, trade unions used to have the communist and socialist ideologies that somehow were discourses that could mobilize, the anarchist ones, the social Catholic ones as well, for many trade unions are very important. More recently, the anti-global, the human rights discourse is very important, and so on. But it has become a little bit more fragmented. And there is also the area of coalition power. That is a little bit more problematic because we enter here very much from a study of the structure of what pre-exist trade unions and labor strategy can be used by labor in their own activity to the actual activity. So coalitions are something that trade unions or worker groups do in practice. It's not something that pre-exists them. So if they don't enter a coalition, the coalition doesn't exist. So in order to define coalition as a power resource, we have to define it as the availability of other social actors which are potentially mobilizable alongside workers, at least on some struggles, maybe not on everything, but at least on some, okay? The coalition itself, in my view, cannot be classified as a power resource for the simple reason that I've seen coalition being created overnight. So it's something that didn't exist the day before and it was created. It doesn't take a lot of time to create a coalition. You make two phone calls or you meet in the street in two protests and say, well, let's organize demonstrations together. It doesn't, it's not something you have to work on for years and you have to institutionalize. So it's more something contingent. But the availability of other important social movements or social actors in society that can be on your side, that is something which is not in control of trade unions and can be considered as a coalition power resource. Some have focused also on the communicative side. It is the capacity of communicating. Again, we are already sliding towards, let's say, the more practical things that trade unions may want to do or not to do. But for instance, if we think about international coalition, certainly the capacity of communicating language-wise, but especially culturally and legally, institutionally, with actors who come from completely different situations, it can be seen, can be a power resource. Some trade unions have this capacity to communicate, make alliances with people, with workers in other places. Some trade unions do not have that capacity. Now, let's say some criticism to make it a little bit more lively, because it's not something, it risks becoming, the more it is watered down, this power resource, saying, the more, people start saying, well, does it help or doesn't help? Now, I mentioned three. Jörg Novak is a sociologist working in Brazil, mostly on strikes, and he wrote that was a book review, I think, of Arnholz and Refson book of 2024, where he criticized in particular the fact that despite his class struggle roots, the power resources approach became something a bit vague about some organizations are powerful, some are not, and they lost the sight of capitalism. That's important, for a political economy spring school. And in particular, he says, well, what's the point of saying that some power is structural and some is not? All is structural in capitalism. Ideology is structural, is superstructural, but it's linked to the structure. Institutions are structural. Everything is structural in capitalism. So we have to put economic power first and then everything else, but everything else is also structural because it is also all linked to capitalism. To this one can add a little bit the idea that, well, it doesn't, the power resource theory doesn't reflect about the alternatives to capitalism. This second side, in my view, is a little bit weak because, well, there was no assumption, no ambition by Corpi or Eric Olin Wright or any of them to say that they have a theory that goes beyond capitalism. It is a theory of labor in capitalism. It is a theory of the relations between labor and capital. If you don't have capital, that theory is totally irrelevant. But then, there's no point even talking about it. And one could add, also, all of Marxism is a theory of labor in capitalism. Marx wrote some tens of thousands of words about the working class in capitalism. He wrote 5 or 6 pages about labor after capitalism. Something when he was very young, and something in the letter to his friends. But never put anything in his book. So we are talking about analysis of capitalism. If you want to talk about something else, let us start talking about it, but we move to a completely different field of analysis. One thing maybe Novak doesn't appreciate, I don't think it is his fault, is that this is maybe the fault of some of the literature in power resources. It focuses only on the power resources of workers. Novak is absolutely right. We have to consider the power of capitals. And that is absolutely true. But that was the idea of Corp initially. It was not just the power of Swedish trade unions on its own. It was the power of Swedish trade unions compared to the power of Swedish employers. So the Social Democratic Party of the trade unions was important and strong because the political parties of the bourgeoisie were weak. If the political parties of the bourgeoisie had been strong like the Nazi party in Germany, the history would have been different. If that is crucial, both in structural power, in associational power, in institutional power, you have to look at both. And this is why the fact that workers achieve some power resources on its own doesn't mean anything about the results and the outcomes until we have compared these power resources with the power resources of the other side. Sometimes workers get more power resources, and employers get even more. This is basically what Sarrah was saying yesterday. Yes, there have been some achievement by workers in Asia, some good news here and there and so on. But in general, the structure of capitalism and the increased international competition and so on and so forth has increased the power of employers even more than the one of workers. And so far, the things are not improved. Then there's Maurizio, who unfortunately had to leave this today. He was here yesterday. Who focused on the fact that still, also the power resource approach only focuses on trade unions. Okay, this fetishism of trade unions. In part, this is absolutely true. I mean, let's remember, methodologically, if you are interested in the interest of workers, if asking the trade unions is not automatically the best indicator. That's absolutely true. But in the power resources argument, there isn't really, it's not necessary to look only at trade unions. You can apply more in general to other actors. Theoretically, that's not a problem. There is a problem empirically because the institutionalization of labor power, at least in Europe, has been mainly through the form of trade unions. Only trade unions have the power of strike, okay? So we can give up the trade unions and say, well, workers, of course, can also organize, go on strike without the trade unions, but they can be fired. So are we sure that, theoretically it is possible and it happens all the time, but before giving up a form that over 100 years have provided a certain right so you can go on strike and not be fired, that increases massively your power resources, well, obviously, you have to think twice. But this becomes an empirical problem. Of course, it can be also counter arguments. It's not inherently a big theoretical issue. The main point, I think, maybe which is important with regard to Maurizio's work, is that, of course, there is a very important source of spontaneous solidarity among workers, which is crucial, is, I would say, a part of that structural power that workers can have in certain community because they know about the workplace, they can share opinions very quickly, they can slow down their work effort and so on and so forth. That is absolutely important. But if we are interested in the research question of Corpi about how to explain whether things over time go better or worse, it's not enough to look at the moment of mobilization. You have to also look at how things keep going while workers are not on strike, because under capitalism, by definition, workers cannot go on strike 100% of the time. Okay, that would be the denial of capitalism. It would be maybe a good thing, but it's not possible, right? So Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who started industrial relations definition, basically, they define trade unions as continuous organization for the improvement of workers' condition. That continuous is absolutely important. Then you have spontaneous organization just for the strike and so on, which can be very important. But then, after 6 months, a worker will still need some support if the manager wants to fire them or if the manager wants to worsen the working condition, change the terms and so on and so forth. And the union is not necessarily the formal recognized institution, is the idea of having continuous organization that on any day a worker can use to defend their situation if they are harassed at work or whatever. The last point by Morozovic, I think that is an important one. We discuss more, obviously, all this area tomorrow. It's about social reproduction, not including social reproduction. All this power resources about production, okay? Class, traditional, capital, labor. A part of his argument, I think, in my views, misses a little bit the point, because then he says, you know, what happens with strikes and so on, with labor mobilization, is also very important for social reproduction. Of course. But that, in a way, was also for Esping Andersen. Esping Andersen was interested in explaining the welfare state, which is then in social reproduction. That is not really criticism. Of course, if workers mobilize for better services, for better conditions in the public sector, for better education, for better care, and so on and so forth, that is hugely important for social reproduction. But that is true. Sometimes we forget it, how important this area is, but it's not outside the original theory of power resources. The other potential argument is, I think, much more intriguing, whether there are some power resources in social reproduction that affects the power of labor. That is, I think, an understudy issue where probably all the feminist perspective, intersection, and so on can help understanding a little bit more. So the feminization, so-called feminization of employment, if it turns into, first of all, higher employment rate, and therefore the difficulty for employers to use women as a reserve army to threaten workers who are already employed. And if it increases, and there is empirical evidence that it does, the sensitivity of workers and trade unions to issues of social reproduction, in particular, I would say working time. That's the clearest and maybe easiest to study issue. Because working time has a good advantage, and you can study it across sectors, across countries, everywhere. The day has 24 hours. The fact that trade unions have become more sensitive to the working time issue, because those more involved in social reproduction are more sensitive to the organization of the time in the day than people who are more engaged only in the material economic production. That obviously changes the situation, I would say, in the power relation between capital and labor, and potentially changes also the kind of game. I mean, that is, I think, a very interesting point. It is the increase in women agency in the trade unions. In most countries now, women are, the majority of members of trade unions are women. There are some exceptions, but in the majority of countries they are. That can be a resource, and it can be also a way to move labor power from just the negotiation of wages to the negotiation of the organization of life in the broader sense. So I think that is an interesting point. Now, my point, if you with me, I mean, I'm not a Rothko, okay? So that's not great as a picture. But the important point to remember is that the way to look at it, the relation between power and power resources, I think has to be a bit of a constructivist one. So power resources are interested in the structure, but that doesn't mean we are not interested anymore in strategy. Some of the empiricist literature in the last couple of years has only been interested in the actions. So let's find that little factory where there's been a strike. What kind of power did they use? Fine. That was not really what Corpi or even Eric Olin Wright were interested in. They were interested in the broad picture of capitalism, okay? And there is a little strike of 10 workers there or 15 workers there, doesn't matter very much if it doesn't produce resources for the class as a whole. So at the top, you have the power resources, the structural side. Obviously, the story doesn't end there, because with the action of trade unions or workers' group, if they're not trade unions, they can also invest in resources. I made the example of strike funds before. Strike funds don't fall from the sky. A trade union has to make a strategic decision to organize a strike fund. Some trade unions have never. The Italian ones don't have strike funds. They always said, oh, we find other ways to protest and make a big mess very quickly without needing the strike funds, right? In other places, they really invested strategically, and it's very important. So they can invest in resources. They can invest in organizational capability and whatever else. Then they can decide to mobilize, okay? That may happen all the time, some time, and so on. When they mobilize the resources, It's important every now and then to mobilize. I remember a trade unionist in Germany once telling me, Germany has the lowest rate of strikes in Europe, as we had for a long time. I say, yeah, but we need to organize a strike every 5 or 6 years, otherwise people forget how to do it. Like the drill of the Swiss army. They haven't had a war for 200 years, but they have to make drills every couple of years. When you have the resource mobilization, two things may happen. One thing that our colleagues here in social movement with the processual approach have very, very strong understanding is that during the Power in Action, Donatella Della Porta on tomorrow will talk about it as well. You can maximize and multiply the resources. That usually happens. If you have a good strike, organized strike, then people will feel more confident and so on. You get more members. Then you turn that into good agreements, in more rights, and so on and so on and so forth. So you can multiply the resources, and therefore then the cycle starts. Again, then in a few years, you have more power, which you can use strategically to invest in even more power resources, and so on and so forth. However, that is not a necessity. And that is why the lower part of the scheme is more the study of agency and action, and the top is the one about structure. Because unfortunately, we also know that sometimes mobilizing resources depletes the resources. If you organize strikes and the strike fails, well, at Fiat in Italy, there were a lot of strikes in the 60s and 70s. There was a huge one in 1980. It was defeated. And for the trade union at Fiat to reorganize a strike, it took 10 years. 10 years, okay? Because it didn't work well. So you don't have the guarantee you organize a big strike, you'll become more powerful. Exactly the opposite might happen. Not only, let's assume that you use your institutional resources. You sign a fantastic agreement with the government. It looks like you increase your power a lot, but maybe then that agreement, the government is corrupt or whatever else, that agreement depletes your resources in terms of popular support and legitimacy and so on, because you are associated with a political class that is not popular. It's what happened to Italian trade unions. So you can see really the fall in popularity once they got so close to government. They achieved a lot. In 93, they achieved new collective bargaining, representation rights, and so on and so forth. But they were identified with institutions, and they lost. They depleted clearly their social structures. Now, I finish with this slide because otherwise I go further. I had some example, but example they are not new, and they are all in a chapter I put in the reading, so you can read them if you're interested. Now, the point is, doesn't matter which power resource employ. I mean, this exercise of distinguishing things, doesn't matter or not. I would say yes. I would say yes because different resources have different results. And that is where we can theorize. There is a very important argument by Janke Hassel about the fact of using almost exclusively institutional resources as the labor movement in Germany has done. Becomes a curse because you can become very strong in some areas, but you'll be very weak in other issues. Especially be very weak when the labor market has a structural change, because institutions will remain in the old part of the labor market, and the new workers, women, migrants, service sector workers, and so on, you don't have any tools to reach them, to mobilize them, and so on. And also, there is a problem where the Corpi assume that one resource can be used to become another one. So you organize a strike, you have association, or you can transform it to another form of energy, let's say, even physically. You can turn thermal energy into other form of mechanical energy and so on. You have associational power, you can turn into institution, you can turn the institution into power and so on. Yes, you can do a little bit, but this game, sometimes it breaks. And sometimes if you decide to shift from associational power to institutional power, you may actually, as I said, undermine your associational one and so forth. So an example is of my current study in Prato, which is near here, is the fact that migrant workers are mobilizing, but different trade unions are using completely different resources. And the difficulty of having a coalition is that both sides think that in order to use associational power, you have to stay far away from the institutions. And the other side says, in order to have institutional power, you have to stay far away from form of mobilization that undermine institutions, and therefore you have the fights within the working class on this issue. So there will be the three examples. I leave them, but they are all in a chapter which is in the reading. And just to finish, two broader questions are they, to keep in mind. Do unions still matter? As I said, not necessarily. Unions are a historical form of labor organization. There may be other ones. Okay. However, we also know that during the crisis recently, in many ways, Vincenzo mentioned some of the issues yesterday on Euro governance. Also, politics and capitalism, after trying to destroy the trade unions and collective bargaining, realized that maybe they had thrown too many things, and the disruptions in politics that we have, and the economy, and so on, are maybe even more costly for employers than having the trade unions. In a way, in that curve, Eric Olin writes, we move back from a relatively high compromise to a lower one. So the labor is weaker, but also employers are weak. So that's an interesting point. And also we see that actually, despite many odds, trade unions are actually entering remote work. Seems to be a big competition. There is now research that remote work, trade unions have had an effect during the pandemic, and in platforms and other forms of work. The other issue to keep in mind is that maybe trade unions as formal institutions have changed their role. I think it was mentioned in the sessions about inequality that collective bargaining was crucially important for economic equality. Yes, it was. Whether it is still now, some say no. Because if trade unions keep as members only the middle class, especially in the public sector, if they improve wages for their members, that may not be good for equality in general, because the gap between those who are represented, if the represented workers are those in the top half, actually, they can forget about the other one. So we can't assume anymore that trade unions are good for equalities. Despite this, the big literature reviews on the topic across countries say that in the majority of places, still trade unions and collective bargaining are good for equality. So, but we are at the moment where this has to be tested all the time. And the same on new issues. On the environment will be the biggest one, where the trade unions are good for workers and for collective interest in general, or if they only represent certain interests, especially in the old industry, actually they may be in the long run a bad story. Again, it is possible. It is a big problem that needs to be raised. It's not necessarily a situation. Actually, researchers in most cases, workers are ready to support just transition and so on. But of course, these are big questions to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guglielmo, for the interesting presentation, and also both sketching out the power resources theory / approach, and then moving on to the criticisms, which I think are a great point to also start the discussion. We will start with you, Iraklis, and then Lucia.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Guglielmo, for this very nice and insightful presentation. I think you highlighted a very central aspect of the power resources approach, not only by pointing the strengths, but also by addressing, let's say, some of its limitations and so on. In my short reaction, I'd like to stress the added value of of adopting this approach to better understand the classic conflict between capital and labor when it comes to migrant workers. And in particular, I'd like to introduce 2 points. The first point concerns how the power resource approach can help overcome some traditional dilemmas in the study of migrant labor organizing. And the second one relates to the relationship between the mobilization of individual resources among migrant workers as a way to resist employers and the emergence of collective organizing, because in this, let's say, approach, there are some references to individual resources, to the mobilization of individual resources, but the, let's say, there is not much study and research on this. So, of course, it is crucial to remind what also you refer about migrant labor, about the possibility of migrant labor to organize, to leverage, to mobilize their collective power, mobility power. We know that migrant workers have been difficult, or in cases even impossible, to organize. So trade unions have often faced a dilemma between protecting the rights of local workers and those of migrant workers. And for many years, so migrants have been seen as not worth the effort to organize. On the other hand, migrants many times have not been interested in unionizing because of their migratory plans, of their temporary the temporary character of their stay, and also because other times they have no trust in unions. So you see, you referred to Alberto Senzachetto's work and the division, of course, on between associational and structural power by right. And here, I think that it would be interesting to focus on the concept of transnational mobility bargaining power that these two authors, Alberto and Sacchetto, introduced. And this point concerns the role of coalitional power, because if we adopt a transnational perspective, the argument here can be that labor mobility should not be seen, so the mobility of workers and the capacity of workers to mobilize the resources to change, let's say, change jobs or to threat to do so. So this labor mobility should not be seen as a problem, so in terms of social dumping in the country of destination, or in terms of labor drain in origin countries, but it can be seen as a potential resource that can generate new forms of conflict and bargaining power both in destination countries and in countries of origin. This can happen if we adopt a transnational framework, and for instance, there are some examples cited by these two authors, for instance, how Mexican trade unions try to organize Mexican workers that will go to the States in order to work. So the idea here is that there can be, let's say, a transnational cooperation between unions and between organizations in order to promote the interest of labor. So my question here is, what do you think about this kind of coalitional power in the EU context? So is it possible to expect relevant examples within the EU space? Other, let's say, the conditions within, let's say, can we expect that trade unions in EU countries can cooperate, or even other European countries? Is this the case? And something more analytical, I think that this approach, and when we are talking about the mobility power of migrant workers, put too much attention on temporary workers, so people who are continuously moving, and not only between jobs but across space. But I think that what misses here is an attention on people or migrants who are settled migrant population. So I'm wondering whether, let's say, power resources approach can move a bit beyond the idea that migrant labor is connected always to labor mobility because of the temporary character of migration. This is the first point. And the second point, as I was saying, I would like to discuss the idea of mobilization of individual resources among migrant workers, and the possibility that these individual actions can lead to, let's say, collective organizing or even broader societal change. And here the idea comes from another recent study in the Italian context made by Valeria Piro, who studied how migrant workers organized in the meat processing sector in Italy. And her research suggests that labor mobility and labor mobilizing should not be seen as, let's say, separate phenomena, but there can be a kind of continuum between individual and collective action. Here, the idea is that when migrants join independent unions and grassroots organizations, they can improve their workplace conditions, they can improve also their personal situation and condition in terms of legal status, of access to welfare rights, and so on. And what this study demonstrates is that when migrant workers join this kind of organizations that are different from the traditional unions in terms of organization, so we are talking about horizontal organizations, we are talking about less bureaucratic structures. So the idea here is that migrant workers can be empowered because there is much information circulated within, let's say, the network. So migrants can change jobs, can change workplaces, they can provide information to other people, and the more migrants join this organization, the more we can expect that other migrants can be empowered through these individual initially actions. And then the idea is that this labor mobility can contribute to spreading collective practices. So the question could be here, for instance, if according how do you think, what do you think about the idea that traditional unions' limitations in defending migrants are mainly dependent on their structural characteristics? So it is about a question of structure, and of course, what are the limitations of grassroots organization in relation to migrant organizing? And if I can add a last comment, what is also a very, let's say, interesting in recent studies in migrant organizing and power resource theory is about the role of NGOs and non-union actors in organizing and participating. But on the other hand, I think that what is often missing in the debate is the role of anti-immigrant mobilizations, anti-immigrant, let's say, parts of the civil society, because the discussion, I feel that the discussion is always on parties, what parties and other institutions do within this, let's say, framework. But what do we can we say about, let's say, the role of, let's say, this anti-immigrant actors, let's say, in terms of power resources approach? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iraklis. I think you both will complement each other very well. So we're going to move on to Lucia now.
Thank you. I would first thank the organizer for inviting me and all the presenters, and of course, Guglielmo, for your thought-provoking presentation, which has clearly shown, I think, the importance of power resource approach to understand the contemporary labor relations, moving also beyond the institutional determinism of other approaches, such as varieties of capitalism, which has been crucial in previous years, which treated the workers' power as a kind of dependent variable, no? While now workers' power is put at the core of the analysis. And then we have also clearly shown how the theory now became an approach and has traveled over the years, being also expanded, like from the overt exercise of power to the latent dimension of power resources, moving also beyond narrow boundaries of workplace. And more recently, in their book, Arnold's Flesflow, they've gone also further, also giving a more detailed definition of some crucial preconditions, I think, to understand power resources, such as interest, the definition of interest, strategies, and preferences, for instance, interests are crucial in mobilizing power resources and are defined in the book by Arnold Serreslon as collectively articulated preferences. I will stress this point here because it will be crucial also in my further point. Within this framework, different forms of power can be identified, of course, but two aspects are essential, I think. One, power defined in its like contextual dimension, and this is a very important point, and in its relational dimension, even if, as you have already stressed in your presentation, sometimes, and I agree with this critique, this relational dimension of power still lack an adequate reflection, at least now, it was different at the beginning, a reflection on workers' power vis-a-vis employers' power. Even more if we stress this contextual dimension of power resources approach. Then I think that this theory approach also resonates with my research interest, the one on intersectionality in labor studies. Intersectionality defined in its materialist and structural dimension. So basically defined in its multi-level dimension. So focusing not only on individual experiences, but also on how these individual experiences are shaped by structural social processes, and the articulation between the micro and the macro level lies in the meso level of collective action, networks. And so this approach can be crucial also in analyzing labor. So this approach focuses on context-based power relations, once again, where also class, defined as heterogeneous and intersectional collective identity, plays a crucial role. So this intersectional perspective, which breeds theory, methods, and also emancipatory praxis, acknowledges the crucial role of labor, and I argue allows for a deeper and more complex analysis of labor in all its complexity. Starting from this perspective, of course, the first point I would like to stress more, because you have already mentioned it in your presentation, is the fact that basically the power resource approach is still mostly focused on workplaces and the point of production. When society enters the discussion, it often appears in terms of political or ideological legitimization of what happens at workplaces, within workplaces. But when raising the point in relation to the definition of structural power, Nowak, for instance, refers to the conditions for the reproduction of the relations of production. And this is clearly in line with the more recent definition of social reproduction approaches. There too, there has been a move from theory to approaches. For instance, the definition given by Mezzadri and other scholars in their paper entitled Pluralizing Social Reproduction Approaches, where they say, social reproduction refers to biological reproduction, the production of life-sustaining goods and services in the home and in the community, the regeneration of culture and ideology, and how the processes and activities above interplay with capitalist relation of production, whose trajectories are entangled with colonial and post-colonial history. So basically this relates to the second point you stressed when talking about social reproduction, how power resources in the social reproduction field may somehow make easier the use of other power resources also in the field of production. For instance, if social reproduction is a field of value extraction, of increased control over workers, may also become a field where conflict is organized, as also stressed by Tacchetto and Alberti in their books, no? Especially for the most marginalized workers. But also, what about social reproduction, a kind of condition of possibility for accessing other forms of power resources? For instance, how to keep on striking. I mean, the crucial role of social reproduction, it can keep on striking. But also, what about the reproductive structural power of workers? So some kind of strike or disruptive force, which is not directly disruptive in the field of production, but in the field of social reproduction, and indirectly also in the field of production. And then we can also like open the reflection to the definition of the reproductive feminist strike, the feminist strike which links actually production and reproduction, and would be also interesting in terms of analyzing how power resources are mobilized. Then the second point relates to identity, maybe. from two perspectives. The one is that I think that the power resource approach treat the notion of the very definition of workers in a very simplistic way, and also the definition of union. And here maybe I relate also to Maurizio Azzeni's critique of the union fetishism. No, of course it is important to remain attentive to the specific resources that the different groups of workers may possess, also the different resources that different trade unions may use. You mentioned, for instance, the case of Prato, no? Where different grassroots mainstream unions rely on different power resources. But the question, the comment is also to what extent the definition of union identity, like relating to Hyman definition, but also to Hodder and Codera La Palma definition of union identity, how this also impact in the strategies unions may adopt to and decide to mobilize one resource rather than another. On the other hand, the issue of workers' identity. I mean, as I said, it seems to me that this power resource approach, workers are defined as a quite homogeneous social group, while this approach does not sufficiently account for the increasingly heterogeneous social composition of today's workforce, both at the global and the national level, as also highlighted by Iraklis, particularly in relation to gender, to power relation based on gender, age, race, and ethnicity. This heterogeneity may affect the attempts to define shared interests, which are at the very core of collective action, and the concrete possibility to mobilize one resource, power resources rather than another. So how also this issue can be inserted into the analysis. The third point is about time. I mean, if we refer to configuration of power resources, if we stress the contextual dimension of this approach, the relational dimension of this approach, so also time counts. I mean, one actor, one union, let's say, may start mobilizing as coalitional or structural power, and then changing over time may turn towards institutional or associational power, or the relation between worker powers vis-a-vis employers' powers, of course, change over time. And this also relates, for instance, to the notion of protest chains, no? How protests may, time allows also to capitalize power and to pass from latent to open exercise of power. So I would like to know what do you think also this time dimension in the mobilization of power. And then the last point, this is real, it's not a real question. What about, I mean, I relate to Mrozowiecki's critique of the Western bias of power resource approach. The Global South is often used mostly as an interesting case study, empirical case study, but what about theorization coming from the Global South, if there is something interesting, which may also challenge our empiricist taxonomy of power as defined here in the Global North. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for the many exciting points. Guglielmo, how would you like to do this? Would you like to? Okay, let's collect. Okay, I think I will follow the approach of yesterday, where I will focus on one part of the room, and then I will come to the second part of the room. So we're going to do a first round from over here. Sorry, I don't know anybody's name, so I'll just point you first. Federico, what's your question?
Federico from the University of Turin. Pleasure, Carlo Alberto. And
1 second, Federico, because the mic is cutting off. We need to know if. Okay, come.
So, can you hear me? Okay. I have kind of an economics background, so I hope to not be redundant, but regarding of your presentation, I was thinking about the fact that nowadays we are seeing that the structural power is reduced due to the fragmentation of workers, also the liberalization of the markets in European countries. In Italy, we see that. Also, the institutional power of workers has been reduced with the Accordo Ciampi and liberalization of the economy. So also the loss of the sliding scale and all these things. But so from this point of view, there is a change in the composition of resources used by in the mobilization by workers, because as we can see now, there are kind of new forms of mobilization in the last years. From like some point of view, for instance, associational, we see there are different workers that from different areas, different sectors are starting to strikes together. We are seeing some examples, for instance, from Sikobas, Sudkobas, also in Turin now are emerging new also non-NGOs and that are organizations that are trying to take together different forms of workers that shares the same similar conditions. And also from other side, we have other examples of other kind of resources, right? Like societal resources, for instance, GKPN, which includes the civil society in the debate, tries to make hegemonic kind of debate, so mobilizing the civil society. And so, yeah, this is also the proposing the paradigm. There is a tendency in the change of resources, the sending of institutional and structural power.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guglielmo, for this excellent overview of the issues. Let me tease you on time and space. On space, we have had the globalization of capitalism. We did not have a globalization of trade unions. So there are, how would you fit the question of the ability of labor and of organized labor to organize thinking about cross-border activism? This has some institutional dimension with the negotiation within multinational work council and so on, with a limited scope. And there has been a feedback from the global justice movements, which have been investing labor to some extent in the 90s and 2000s. So this is space. On time, you mentioned the work in time. I think this is a very important issue, which is often forgotten in our work, both as economists or sociologists, because in the last 30 years, the historic decline of working time has stopped, even when the digital technologies could potentially offer the greatest benefits in terms of reduction of working time, as opposed to other things. Of course, capital has been preventing this, but the issue of working time links very nicely with all the social reproduction story. And so I am a little bit surprised that working time has not been relevant, not only in trade union strategy, but also in our reflection on that.
Yes, Max Planck Society, and I'm a PhD student. So thank you for your presentation. I find it very wonderful that this is also part of the summer school today. And I have 2 points. Like once I want to take up the point of Dimitriadis with the anti-immigration attitudes among workers, because I think when I was talking to Eastern Europe, Eastern German people working in the automobile industry, they were telling me, for example, that the trade unions are also competing with the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, because they were waiting before their workplaces, basically. And also the aspect that trade unions are not immune to right-wing social movements, because even the people from the right-wing extremist parties are also sitting in the trade unions more and more, and how you could explicit that because power is not only power, power is not neutral and can also shift to the right and does not always have to be a leftist movement, even if it's trade unions. And also, I would like also to take up a point from with the social reproduction, because also social reproduction is also largely institutionalized at the moment when we think of care work in like hospitals or kindergartens, and those sectors don't have a high union density. And sometimes I'm thinking maybe this is also a missed potential of trade unions to not pick up these people, because as we saw with COVID, there were a lot of strikes, and maybe this is also a problem of union identity because it's very like this industrial image of all industrial workers, and maybe it's a missed potential. And could you elaborate on this?
One last question. So from this.
A very quick question for Professor Meardi. You spoke a little bit about Corpi's original theory on power resources and how that depended strongly on the composition of the political parties in Sweden at the time. This was, of course, subsequently built up by İpek Ilkkaracan in Politics Against Markets. And I'm curious, considering that this is also a very kind of political theory that isn't limited exclusively to the labor market and other kinds of aspects that you discussed, how do you think that the change in the relationship between trade unions and political parties, of course, Sweden at the time that Corpi and İpek Ilkkaracan were writing had automatic membership in the Social Democratic Party for LO members. The Labour Party had the trade union bloc vote until it was, ironically kind of phased out with the complicity, actually the active participation of the left. In Spain, there was, very close relations between the UGT and the PSOE for some time, and then that was, of course, abolished. Considering that in the 1990s and in the 2000s, and sometimes even in the 80s, these links were deliberately kind of cut. With some exceptions, I guess you can make the case that in Bolivia, with the unity pact between MAS-CPSP and the various kinds of trade unions of the country, there was a much stronger organic link organizationally between political parties and labor movement. Do you think that do you think it's important to look at ways in which this kind of link can be recomposed? Do you think there's any perhaps models in that respect, or do you think that's in some way kind of an overrated question or something we shouldn't be paying too much attention to? Thank you.
Emma, do you want to? Yeah, and then I'll take two more questions from the other side.
How many there are on this side, just to know how much time I went? At least 2, 3. Okay, good. Thank you very much. All very provoking, which is great. Now, I start with Iraklis, whose main point was about where and how and whether migrants can be a power resource or not. We can narrow it down to that. Ruth Milkerman has written great stuff about the fact that migrants, in theory, they are competing. It's the typical reserve army, but in the history of the US labor movement, most of the time, they have made labor stronger. They came with traditional solidarities, new ideas, new associations. In general, they have been a resource, and the trade unions themselves have understood and learned a lot. If you're at the beginning of the 20th century, American trade unions were rather xenophobic, in particular against the Chinese, but quite in general, Japanese, but quite in general, and they have moved on from there quite a lot. So there's been a positive learning process, and in general, migrants have become resources. Said that. Which resources? Because Milkman looks basically at a traditional association of solidarity and so on. Alberti and Sacchetto, in their book of 2024, they add something different, which is the mobility, the collective mobility power. And that is, I think, a little bit more problematic, interesting, but also problematic. I personally have studied a lot industrial relations in Central Eastern Europe. Of course, mobility in the terms of immigration for descending countries can be actually tends to be, or even is, a source of structural power because the labor market changes. I mean, I study Romania and Poland. They move from mass unemployment above 20% to very important labor shortages in relatively few years, and wages have gone up a lot. That's great. But politically, my hypothesis of almost 20 years ago that exit, and that is mobility, could also lead to voice, that is association of political power, that hasn't happened. Trade unions have not become stronger. Some people even more pessimistic than myself, like Roland Dern and Sabina Stan on this field, said, well, actually immigration perpetuates a cycle of depression in the labor movement. And therefore in Romania, yes, wages have gone up hugely, but trade unions are not strongest. So that is already one side. But the bigger problem, I think you were mostly focused on, and then there were questions about anti-migrant feelings and so on, is what happens to the countries of arrival. And here, the idea of Alberto Sacchetto is that by organizing collectively something that usually has been seen as individual, that is the exit strategy. If a worker, if he's unhappy, according to Hirschman, can do two things: change job or fight for better conditions. And the two things, it's difficult to do both at the same time. That's nearly impossible in human's life. But if you organize it collectively, well, first you can share information among migrants about better opportunities, so they're not stuck in a bad place. You can try to improve their rights to move and so on. That's all very, very important. I think on that, it's a hugely important argument. But potentially can also be politically positive. This is the side I need to be convinced. I'm not sure it is wrong, but I don't think we have the empirical evidence yet. What I can say, which relates to the power resources argument about the difficulty of using different power resources, is the fact that traditionally trade unions have not used the mobility power. They've been very wary about that. Single groups might have been, okay, a very single group, I mean, you may find plumbers using it because, of course, they can move around, fine. But in general, they have been wary of using market arguments because they know that they can work today and they don't work tomorrow. If you focus all your bargaining strategy on the fact, oh, nowadays unemployment is low, you have to raise our wages because the labor market conditions are different. 2 days later, the employer will come and say, oh, look, unemployment is higher, so wages have to go down. Okay? So generally, trade unions have not used that argument as their main argument. They have used a lot of other ones. They have used the ideological one about the dignity of labor. They have used the efficiency one, and workers work better if they're treated well. They have used political arguments that people will protest. They have used other arguments rather than just the market economic one, because that inherently is something that works today, doesn't work tomorrow. And I fear that also the collective mobility power is something that can work today for certain groups, but I need to be shown the evidence over time that will actually help. With one exception, which I agree with them, is the fact that you have to increase migrant workers' right to move from an employer to another. So a situation where they don't have mobility in the sense that, like in seasonal worker schemes and so on, they are tied to one employer. They cannot change jobs. Obviously, it is crucial in those cases for trade unions to fight for their rights to change job if they're treated badly. That is absolutely true. But we are talking there about a situation where workers don't have the minimum rights of citizenship and of being free workers. Okay, on that, I absolutely think they have a very strong argument. On the comments from Lucia. Firstly, she had very interesting comments. I think the feminist strike is an interesting case. I mean, again, the evidence is still coming. Let's say it's an initiative for a few years. Will that grow into a more, systematic resource that can be used in both production, social production, and so on? But that clearly is a case, a new case where something coming more from social reproduction, because it comes more from feminist movements. It doesn't come, it's not organic, let's say, to the traditionally organized working class, can actually become a resource that trade unions can use and say, look, work. You know, we have people protesting because they are not treated well in a number of spheres of lives, and that can become also a collective bargaining argument and so on. So it's absolutely an important case to keep studying. She's also absolutely right on the fact, and you mentioned that traditionally, we are not discovering something new. It has always been important, social reproduction. In a way, there is something also in Marx on that. But certainly, the fact that women have supported strikes, I mean, the minor strike, you do not understand it without the role of women and so on and so forth. But that is obviously important. But I think the crucial thing in terms of power resources is whether the more activism by women can turn into a factor that can really put pressure on politics and government to improve things for workers. In terms of space, that's crucial. That's a huge question, which was raised by you and then more by Mario. Well, trade unions are secondary as an organization, okay? First, capital organizers, and then workers organize. I'm sorry for the workerists here who like Tronti and so on, and they say the workers come first and capital comes after. I think historically is not entirely correct. So capital is already organized. Global companies are organized. For workers to organize takes a little bit of time. First, they have to be organized by capitalism into workplaces. And it's much more difficult to organize at the global level than at the local level. At the local level, it took time. It didn't come up like this. It took 100 years for trade unions to emerge as a clearly identifiable movement. It took 100 years. So to think that because there is the WTO automatically the year after all product markets we have organized trade unions, it won't happen. There is a big literature about the inherent difficulty to socialize on that, but I agree it is crucial. I mean, there are two ways basically. Now we are really at a turning point in history. Either we stop globalization, we stop capital mobility and product mobility, and we change economic system, or we need to organize labor at a global level. I mean, it's the mismatch. This mismatch is crucial. Federico asked about new form of mobilization. That's an important point. In a way, in my last slide, I wanted to put that the big question behind is: are workers weaker in general, as the old industrial relations indicator would suggest, or we are at a time where different power resources matter, and so we have to remeasure everything. Okay, so it's that I think is a big question. That was in a way the angle I think of debate on traditional measurement. Yes, the story is quite clear. But if really coalitions are more important, ideas shared, the legitimacy or human rights and so on are more important. If different kinds of institutions matter, we have very different kinds of policies against poverty and so on matters, then we have to study something different than the traditional collective bargaining, union density and so on, which are still relevant. Of course, I am always about getting something new that is better before we throw away the old ones, but certainly we have a shift. So yeah, on the global, on international, maybe I already answered. Working time, you are absolutely right. I mean, working time, probably the peak was in the 90s, but I wouldn't say the reduction of working time. That is the Fordist way of talking about working time has in a way stopped. There was the peak of the 90s, the 35 hours in France was maybe the peak, and the 35 hours agreement in Germany were the peak. In that sense, it's more and more difficult how do you organize working time of riders, on platforms and so on. It's a little difficult. But the issue of working time, I think, has become more important. In particular, the rights of workers to have a say of how working time is organized. That is the flexibility, the worker-centered flexibility. There we have an increased amount of rights, which sometimes remains on paper. That is, workers have the right to change, to ask for better working time, but the employer has the right to say no. But in some cases, some companies, we already have practices where those rights actually have to be. There must be an objective reason for the employers to say they cannot meet the worker demands. I think that is a crucial social reproduction issue. Whether race is a part, yeah, I mean, if obviously if racism divides workers, it is that a big problem. And that's a bit different from being right wing or left wing. Sometimes there are trade unions which are more to the right than to the left. They can still have a role in class politics. The one I studied most is Solidarność in Poland, of course. But obviously, if they divide the workers by, which happens, it's not generally what happens, but it may happen that undermines worker power. With political parties, just one word, because I'm not an expert of political parties, I have to call my political scientist colleagues. You're right. I think the decline of labor power in politics probably is even bigger than trade unions. I mean, trade unions have lost a bit of members. Many votes have the communist parties lost? Nearly everything. Socialist democratic, in some countries, 3/4. So it's much worse than what has happened to trade unions.
Thank you.
Decide.
Okay, we'll just take the 3 questions that had, we'll start with you, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So you have briefly mentioned it, but I think one aspect of power resources that's very often neglected is this ideational and discursive aspect, especially whether and how much the public feels sympathetic to the demand of unions and general labor movements. And I think it's important because not just the absolute number of workers in its traditional sense is decreasing, but also these demands from unions and other labor movements are perceived as this very narrow, conservative, parochial kind of interest by the general public, right? And there could also be this dilemma that pursuing short-term interest could delegitimize them in the long run. The public is just saying, oh, they're just pursuing their very narrow interest. I think that's what happened with the Korean Union, with the British unions, with the American unions. So my question would be, are we as researchers still too much focusing on this divide between capital and labor and forgetting this big chunk of the public who don't narrowly identify with the interests of capital and labor? And from more policy perspective, should unions try to make their demand resonate more with the general public? And if so, how would they do that?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the great presentation. It was very interesting. I'm Giulia Magnano from the University of Padova. Recalling what also Lucia was saying about the role that social reproduction is playing nowadays, that it has been changing significantly. And I think that this is also linked to the changes, obviously, in production, in the levels of wages and of working time. I'm thinking also about the last financial laws of most European countries, which are increasing significantly the level of working times and forcing precarious conditions of labor. And so in this context, I think that also several dimensions of social reproduction that can be, for instance, the role that accommodation plays, the cost of rents, like basic inflation effects at differentiated levels for migrant women and men workers, and how this has also turned in the last years into more individualized relationship between workers and unions, and how this becomes also a challenge for organizing, for associational power, coalitional power. And so I was wondering how this can be framed into the power resource framework, if it's the right one, because I was thinking and reasoning around these transformations, and especially on how this affects the relationship between workers and trade unions. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay. No, yeah. I would like to start with the first point, with the point that Guglielmo raised about the need of a processual analysis, which is, I think, the weakest point of the power resource approach. One side is to say that there is a multiplication. Another side is to admit that there are qualitative leaps in subjectivity and in power building. Because I think that what misses the power resource approach in this type of debate is that there are shifts in political consciousness, in class consciousness. For example, in context like the Arab Revolution in Egypt, you were at the weakest level along all the dimension of power, because crisis and unemployment, institutional repression, and the lack of associational power. But then you have a revolution. The power resource approach doesn't grasp this dynamic of class formation. Of course, nothing emerged from nothing. But one side is to say that there are embryonic dynamics that become qualitative, that expose, and to just admit a multiplication. And well, a counter argument, as you said, power resource approach studies what happens in capitalism. However, I think that the most challenging point about the power resource approach is that it starts from an idea of capitalism as a static system, and not as a dynamic, crisis-ridden social relation in which crisis is omnipresent from a molecular level to a broader dimension. And so intellectually, which has also a political effect, privileging bargaining practices and not accounting for their performative role in class politics, I think it's problematic. I don't think that there is a distinction between a solely bargaining type of class struggle and broader dimensions of class struggle. Well, so to sum up, I think that analytically some concept could be useful of the power resource approach, but intellectually it has this limitation to the bargaining dimension of class struggle, not taking into account that it's not the only horizon, and it's not just something of ideological, because we could discuss and so on. Capitalism is crisis-ridden. We live in enormous chaos, and so starting from this bias, also empirically, can you bring you to neglect all other dimension, more conflict, and so on. Sorry for the long-winded.
Guglielmo, you have 2 minutes to respond to these complex questions.
Good. Now, on the ideational point, yes, I haven't spoken enough about it. It's obviously a huge issue. I would say that, in principle, workers are the majority of society. So there shouldn't be any problem for workers to say, well, we define workers. It should be enough, okay? But it is true that at the ideational level, the idea of the working class, has been that ideational resource, that source of identity and so on, which was working more in the 20th century, let's say, has now been undermined. So that is why
most trade unions speak much less about working class, and they try to say something else apart from just saying workers. I think that has happened. That search for other additional resources has taken place. I mentioned the human rights ones. That is a very important one. They didn't speak about human rights before the 90s trade union. Now they speak about it, in particular in relation to migrants, but not only migrants. And something they try to use. They try to use the argument of better services, of high road, and so on and so forth. So they defend also the social rights by providing better work in the public sector and so on. But it's all a bit difficult in a way to link to the question about political parties, the lack of power in politics. I mean, whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, I've been in the UK. I was in the UK for a long time, and more and more trade unions are considered disaffiliating from the Labour Party. So I think that things still have to get worse before we can start seeing them getting better. I think maybe also that links to the social reproduction. During the COVID crisis, there was an opportunity for a while. Colin Crouch called it the short, I don't remember, the COVID moment or something, where trade unions had a big ideational resource in saying that the dignity of work was important, the dignity of care was absolutely important, and so on. But that was a bit too short for Labour to actually mobilize it and make substantial gains. I'm not saying that, I'm sorry that the pandemic lasted only months and not 20 years. I'm not saying that. Hopefully there are other ways to create opportunities rather than being all stuck with the terrible humanitarian crisis. With social representation and about individualization, that in a way links to this problem. What was the question? Yes. Individualization, that is an issue that's been raised since the 1960s. It shouldn't be exaggerated that people are becoming more individual and so on. When I see the youths nowadays, they are all dressed much more all the same than they used to be when I was young. So maybe they are less individualized and more collectivized, because obviously in different forms by social media or whatever other culture, they seem to be much less individual than at least I think I was when I was young. But indeed, it is what is an issue, I think, is the structural fragmentation of workplaces, careers, definition of professions, and so on. That is obviously a big issue. To Lorenzo, I would say, to put it short, that power resource approach is useless if you want to study revolutions. That's never been its purpose. Obviously, it's totally useless. There is a huge field of study, which is not mine, in the study of revolution, although I happen to have witnessed the revolution when I was in Poland, or a kind of revolution. What I can say is that all revolutions they were determined by other things than power resources. The power of labor. Usually some big crisis of the state for various reasons, either big debt, whether it was France in 1789, or whether Poland in 1989, or whether Russia in 1991, or whether it was a war. Obviously, many other cases. Obviously, power resources approach has nothing to say. We'll never be able to predict a revolution or whatever. If that is a research question, and I perfectly respect those for whom that is the big question when the revolution happens, that is not the theory that is useless. If we want to understand what is happening still within capitalism, obviously it's a less high-level question. I think power resources still has a tool, and in itself, if we go back to the theoretical aspect, it is a class theory. I mean, it actually, a criticism has been raised, it doesn't include the state. It's the two classes. It's very capitalist in a way. It's very adversarial, even if there is potential for compromise. But that compromise is always a precarious compromise that is subject to any change in power resources and therefore of strategy. And therefore, even in Sweden, the employers can withdraw at any time, or the workers may withdraw at any time if they think that a better opportunity arises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for the very lively session. Thank you to Guglielmo and our two discussants and all the questions. We conclude this session. Now it's the afternoon lunch break, and we will reconvene at 1:15 in different working groups for the presentations by you now. So yeah, thanks a lot, and we will start on time at 1:15.
So yeah, without further ado, maybe on that note, we can kick off with the last panel of today. I would like to, as your chair for this panel, I would like to welcome everyone to this panel on gender and labor. I think the last 4 days, we can all agree, have been full of very stimulating discussions and presentations by PhD students, postdocs, as well as professors. And we have been talking through various lenses on issues that are very relevant today for all of us in the department, and I'm sure for all of the ones present in this room, touching upon topics of on political economy, on labor inequalities, on global chains of production. And I think we couldn't have a panel most fitting for the fourth day, dedicating also a quite significant amount of time to go into more deeply into intersectional dimensions of those topics. And without further ado, I would like to welcome and thank on my behalf, Professor İpek Ilkkaracan, if I pronounce it correctly, for not being here with us in presence, but honoring us with her online presence and her time in sharing some of her insights from her work thus far. So İpek will be speaking for around 40 minutes, if that's okay with you. We are a bit constrained with time, as we would need to wrap things up around 6, and İpek needs to go around 5:30, after which we will have two of our discussants from right here in Scuola Normale Superiore, Professor Emanuela Lombardo, full-time professor as of recently here, and our own PhD student, Giulia Giraudo, that will be commenting on İpek's presentation, after which we will open the floor to Q&A, prioritizing it, if anything, from the discussants, given the time limitations. So, İpek, the floor is all yours for the next 40 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, and hello, greetings, good afternoon to all the participants. I wished very much that I was there in person, but due to other commitments, I'm connecting from a long distance away. So let me share my presentation, since we are limited in time. I believe you can see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I understand from the briefing, I had a short briefing on what went on earlier in the school. I understand that the issue of gender care and labor came up also maybe a number of times in other contexts. So let's focus in on a discussion of the connections between labor, work, the economy on one hand, care and gender on the other hand. And I will try to bring all of these together in a future vision of an economy that we call the purple economy, complementing the green economy, sort of, focusing on the complementarities of the issues around gender care and labor with a whole bunch of other economic objectives and phenomena. So this is what I will do in the next 40 minutes. I will start with a brief background looking at evolution of conceptual thinking around gender care and labor. Then I will focus in on what we mean exactly by the care economy and alternative approaches, what is meant by it. Then I will move on to the concept of the purple economy, its definition, guiding principles, and main policy pillars. Then I would like to spend some time on macroeconomics of investing in the purple economy, and to the extent that we have time, or maybe we address that in the Q&A, look at some of the synergies between purple and green economy. Okay, so there is a whole series of terminology around gender care and labor. These concepts evolve from reproductive work all the way to purple economy. And what I will try to do in the next few minutes is to present an evolution of conceptual thinking in historical order. So the concept of the sphere of reproduction, the reproductive sphere, and the productive sphere goes all the way back to writings by Marx and to some extent by Engels, making a distinction between reproductive labor and productive labor. Productive labor has a very specific meaning, as people who are familiar with Marxian economics would know, labor as productive of surplus value. But in those early analyses of the economy of capitalism, there is a distinction made with respect to reproductive labor as labor that is producing the main input into the market production process, into the surplus value production process, by regenerating, reproducing labor on a daily basis and on a generational basis over the longer run. So there the emphasis is very much on how this sphere of production, household production, acts, has a function at a macro level to reproduce and supply labor as a source of surplus value to the productive sphere, to the market sphere. And this provides an entry point, acknowledging that this sphere outside of markets is an area of work and labor, provides an entry point for gender analysis through an emphasis on how there's a gender division of labor, in fact, between these two spheres with different functions. And then we have new terminology arising, such as unpaid work, domestic work, being used interchangeably with reproductive labor, and making the connection to how, through the gender division of labor between these two spheres, this becomes a source of the gender inequalities we observe in the market sphere in paid work and income. Data collection develops along with this. So time use data becomes an important source of data for economic analysis, making these linkages between unpaid domestic work and paid work and gender equalities in the labor market. So that data allows for identification of gender gaps in time use, and beyond making the linkages between these two spheres, it also helps to towards the evolution of new concepts such as time poverty, women's time poverty, employed women's time poverty, and also combined time and income poverty measures as a measure, as a gendered and care-aware measure of well-being. Then in time, we have the terminology such as care work and caring labor, and here the emphasis shifts from for instance, unpaid work, where the emphasis is on the lack of compensation for this type of labor and the exploitation embedded, therefore, through lack of compensation. Domestic work, the emphasis is on the sphere of the workplace being within the household, within the domestic sphere, and its exclusion from the public sphere. With the shift of terminology, with in the late 90s to the 2000s to care work and caring labor, expands really the analytical framework, enabling, for instance, to identify paid care work and paid care workers as an extension of caregiving. And the emphasis here is whether it's unpaid or paid care work, the emphasis here now shifts to the output of this kind of labor. It is basically care services. And through that, then we have further terminology developing, identifying the care economy as a subsphere of paid and unpaid care production activities, and emergence of new concepts, therefore, in this interaction with the market production, the emergence of what some feminist scholars have called the crisis of care, which I will explain all of these concepts shortly. And then through the call of investing in the care economy and towards the prevention of a care crisis, towards gender equality in the market sphere, what we have emerging is the macroeconomics of care, how this is an area for employment creation. It's an area that pertains to fiscal policy, care, responsive budgeting. It is an area that that relates to public investments in care services sectors, and therefore with effects on productivity, sustainability, sustainable and inclusive growth. And finally, care economics emerges as a sort of sub-area of study. And we have these emerging visions of a caring economy, caring democracy, care society, and purple economy as policy objectives beyond sustainable economic order and an inclusive and resilient economy. And as I've said in the outline, some of my emphasis in this presentation will be at the intersection of the purple economy and macroeconomics of care, such as purple investments and purple jobs, which has been an area of my research in recent years. So the care economy is basically a sub-area of economic activities that entails the production of goods and services, but primarily services necessary for the physical, social, emotional well-being of care-dependent groups, first of all, such as children, elderly, ill, people with disabilities, but also for well-being of healthy prime working age adults, including self-care, so as to allow them to function at a socially acceptable level of capability, comfort, and safety. As I've already mentioned, it has unpaid and paid components. The unpaid component is primarily the focus of much research and analysis is household production, but it also entails volunteering community work. And in settings with less developed physical infrastructure, it also entails rural work such as fetching water, firewood, food production and processing for self-consumption. The paid components, the paid care economy, we look at primarily sectors around healthcare, including long-term care services, education, including early childhood care, development and preschool education services, social services, and also domestic and personal services. So time use data has enabled the quantification of the magnitude of this economy in the unpaid component. It corresponds to around 16.5 billion hours per day. And at a regular 8-hour per day shift, it corresponds to reflects almost 2 billion full-time jobs, with only 25% performed by men and the rest performed by women. But there's also substantial regional variation, for instance, in Northern Europe with the appropriate kind of, inclusive economic growth and policy framework and care systems, men's participation performance has increased to as much as 45%. The paid component is almost 400 million workers worldwide, according to a recent estimation. Oops, did I just lose the? You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So making up almost 12% of global employment, and similar to the extension, as an extension of the gender division in unpaid work, we see that the majority of employees in these sectors are women, around 2/3 are women. When it goes onto the paid sphere, the gender division seems to become relatively more balanced. In regions and countries where with more developed care systems, it makes up as much as 20% of total employment, almost double that of the global average. So there's a wide regional variation there as well. That was a sort of a more narrow definition of the care economy. It's an interdisciplinary field, and there are extended definitions where some feminist scholars emphasize how this care economy goes beyond care for individuals and households to also entail care for community well-being, nature and ecological well-being, introducing concepts such as earth care and well-being of all living species. A political scientist, a feminist political scientist, Joan Tronto, in her book called Caring Democracy, as opposed to Caring Economy, calls care as everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So these are the different approaches to what is meant by care, care work, caring labor, and care economy. The concept of crisis of care has been defined differently by different scholars. One early definition by Susan Himmelwhite from 2000s is basically says it's crisis of care is a decreasing willingness and ability of people to care for one another, and erosion of caring norms under unregulated, unchecked, fierce market competition and competitive labor market environments. Another definition by Sergio Floro is coming from a more global South perspective, defines the crisis of care as growing imbalances within and across societies in access to care through overwhelming prioritization of the employment of resources towards meeting the requirements of market production over those of social reproduction. The Human Development Report by UNDP from 2015 was on the concept of work, and it had a whole chapter on unpaid work. And there, UNDP defined the care crisis as emerging care gaps in long-term care in aging societies, as well as situations of unmet care needs in the face of shocks, such as health shocks, or increasing pressures on care under climate change as various indicators of a care crisis. So the idea of a crisis of care obviously became a lot more emphasized and discussed under the recent COVID-19 pandemic, but also it is being thematized under increasing migration flows, human-made and natural disasters. And there the crisis of care brings in the idea that investing in care, in the care economy, is not something that serves only the purpose of gender equality, for example, but also is a strategy for building resilience of communities, societies, and economies against shocks. So coming to the idea of the purple economy, obviously, it's, giving a color to a model or a vision of an economy appeals to the widely used concept of the green economy all the way since the 1980s. The color purple is a symbolic color of feminism in some countries, including my own in Turkey. So it was a term that I coined as a catchphrase for capturing the vision of a gender equal and caring economic order. And there's an emphasis there on and I will explain that shortly. So it originated with some academic work, but then over time it has been adopted by feminist organizations in different parts of the world, such as the European Women's Lobby or some regional feminist organizations in East and Southeast Asia, in the Turkish context, as an advocacy, economic policy advocacy, and also as a economic literacy training tool. So let me start off with the guiding principles. I would like to emphasize three, that the concept warns by putting the emphasis on and. It separates gender equality and caring as self-standing objectives, and in thinking about policy interventions, it warns against the trade-offs between these two objectives, which I will explain shortly. It also, one of the important guiding principles is that it rests on the simultaneous perspectives of caregivers and care receivers. And it also, as the third principle, emphasizes the complementarities of a purple economy with a whole series of other macroeconomic, economic and social policy objectives. So the emphasis on these trade-offs and how purple economy calls for both a caring and a gender equal economy is something that stems from really looking at the various policy proposals that we see on different government agendas. So a conservative policy agenda is one that promotes, that respects, or not respects, but upholds and would like to maintain the gender division of labor to the extent possible, while also allowing women's involvement in the labor market, in employment and access to income to some extent, but not to the same extent, not on equal basis with men, and without foreseeing any engagement by men in care provisioning. So this is what I call the conservative gendered policy agenda, which has becoming increasingly more dominant through the so-called demographic crisis and policies by conservative authoritarian governments to promote fertility. So these are the kinds of policies that foresee, for instance, for mothers, like they can continue to stay in employment to the extent they can afford through part-time work, flexible work, home-based work, for instance, building, ideas of economic justice, gender economic justice on providing pensions for women, enabling them to stay in full-time homemaking, or policies around social transfers for childbirth, wages for care work by family caregivers. So these are this is a policy agenda that promotes a caring economy without respecting the objective, upholding the objective, simultaneously upholding the objective of gender equality. On the other side, we have what I would like to maybe name neoliberal policy agenda, that upholds the needs of markets overall, while in principle, gender equality is something that the neoliberal agenda supports. When you look at actual, implementation or policy proposals, what we see is a set of policies that focus exclusively on how to get women into the market through market incentives, so such as employer subsidies for women's employment, support to women's career advancement, training, skills development, women's entrepreneurship, microcredit for women, and so on. So this is a policy agenda that uses market incentives, that aspires to use market incentives to get more and more women engaged and get women's labor also commodified within the market without having any consideration whatsoever for what happens to the care work. So, and at best, it is employer-provided childcare services for employed mothers, for mothers in employment, not as sort of like an overall access to early childhood care services by all children as a children's right, but rather, in order to keep mothers in employment. So here I have an example of this kind of an approach. A much widely quoted report by McKinsey Global Institute makes a policy simulation and says, if women were to access the exact same employment patterns, the same employment rates, the same employment hours, paid work hours, and wages as men, $1 trillion can be added to global GDP. But then the simulation scenario fails to ask then what happens to billions of hours of unpaid care work that these the women are providing for the well-being of families, households, and communities. The second principle is basically a warning to the approach primarily from a gender equality perspective, saying that what we need is simultaneous perspectives of caregivers and care receivers. So we want equality in caregiving through co-responsibility of private households and the state, and also women and men. But we also want equality in care receiving through universal access to quality care. So approaching this from the perspective of population groups particularly dependent on care, such as children and youth, ill, older persons, people with disabilities, and vulnerable groups, but also including equality in care receiving through self-care. So here are the 4 pillars of a purple economy. A universal social care services infrastructure is a very important pillar that maybe we are the most familiar with when we talk about gender care and labor. Accessible and quality healthcare, education, and care services that are thought of as an infrastructure. So that means it's macro scale, and it's acknowledged that this coordinated macro scale care services infrastructure across healthcare, education, including long-term care and early childhood care and social care services, basically provides an infrastructure for economies to stand on. This is about shifting or redistributing some of the unpaid care work, from taking it from households and moving it to the public sphere or the market sphere, from unpaid work to paid work. The second pillar is with respect to the component of care that will remain within the household and unpaid, that will continue to be provided by family caregivers, but it is about redistributing this from women's unpaid family caregiving to men's unpaid family caregiving. So these are this is the policy intervention in labor market regulation for work-life balance, and the emphasis is with equal gender incentives. So not promoting part-time flexible work only for mothers, for example, but also for fathers with male workers with caregiving responsibilities. And the objective is not to create only dual earner families, but also dual carer and families. So these entail policies such as care leave, including paternity leave of equal length to maternity leave, parental leave that is equally shared, flexible work for both men and women with caregiving responsibilities, shorter working weeks, decent pay, and work conditions for care workers, particularly domestic workers, because care sector is a very vulnerable in many countries, and for quite a range of care workers is a vulnerable employment area. So regulation of that part of the labor market for decent work conditions, and also policies for elimination of gender discrimination in labor markets on the basis of care giving and associated stereotypes. The third component, which is investing in time-saving, this time physical infrastructure and technologies. It says here for rural communities, but sometimes in less developed urban contexts, we also see a lack of physical infrastructure that adds to the unpaid care work burden. So this is particularly important for various countries of the global south with less developed physical infrastructure. It entails improvements in rural water, energy, transport infrastructure to reduce the indirect care work that are predominantly performed by women, but also future-looking. This area entails also, for instance, green investments in sustainable and gender equal agriculture and rural production systems. And the final pillar, which I call an enabling macroeconomic environment, it entails a set of macroeconomic policies where generation of decent jobs, sufficient and decent jobs, is acknowledged not as a sort of a byproduct of macroeconomic policy, but as a direct objective of macroeconomic policy. This is something that also has been quite emphasized in heterodox macroeconomics, like a focus on full employment economy, and what people like, for instance, Donny Roderick have called the good jobs economy. So this enabling macroeconomic environment with a focus on decent jobs generation is important for women and men alike, particularly for lower skilled workers or more vulnerable groups of workers, such as young, recent graduates. But it's particularly important for women because in an environment of high unemployment and lack of decent jobs, it becomes much more probable for women to retreat into full-time homemaking roles, and for an environment where there aren't enough jobs and there aren't enough good jobs creates sort of an economic basis for promotion of gender division of labor and revoking conservative, giving support to conservative ideologies. And so the third principle that I will talk about shortly is basically makes a linkage between particularly the first pillar and the last pillar about how investing in universal social care services sector infrastructure through appropriate fiscal policy and public investments, creating an enabling macroeconomic policy framework becomes the source for generation of purple jobs. So, as I said, the third principle, therefore, emphasizes, takes this issue of gender care and labor being an area that's confined to gender inclusiveness and gender equality, which is very important, but also emphasizes how this is, in fact, through investments in care, provides also a strategy for achieving other macroeconomic and social policy objectives, such as jobs generation. Why? Because care services sectors are very labor-intensive sectors with high employment multipliers, which means that every euro invested in care services sectors has the potential to create more employment, more jobs than the same euro invested in other sectors, such as physical infrastructure, for instance, which is an area where many governments, in order to, for instance, come up with fiscal stimulus packages, that becomes a primary area for fiscal stimulus spending. Physical infrastructure becomes a target for fiscal stimulus spending. And this idea of the, looking at care services sectors as a target for jobs generation, not only for gender equality and for better care, but also as an area for jobs generation, is particularly important in this era of digitalization and AI, where one of the major concerns is how, through increasing productivity, on the better side, this also becomes, sets up the context for destruction of many jobs, and the question of where will the new jobs are going to come from is a major question. So the idea of the purple economy basically says, and all this work around the macroeconomics of investing in care is saying that care services sectors with new innovations, with upgrading of skills, is a new area for employment creation. And this complementarity, like looking at care services sectors as an area with high employment multipliers and jobs generation, and also simulations show that investing in care services sectors through the job creation outcomes also has greater potential for decreasing socioeconomic inequalities and poverty alleviation, sits against the background of a series of applied empirical policy simulations that has been going on since 2010, kicking off with the work at the Levy Economics Institute by Rani Antonopoulos and Kyung Kim, and then I've been involved in some of these policy simulations, and so because so many country simulations have been made, eventually some of the UN agencies, such as the ILO and UN Women, ended up pulling all of these together into policy tools or simulation tools on investing in care services sectors. And this is the idea of these studies, by putting the emphasis of beyond gender equality, what are the multiple economic returns to public investments in care services expansion. And I sort of make the distinction between supply side effects and demand side effects. And when we approach the issue from a gender perspective, we are mostly focused on the labor supply side effects. In other words, if you have access to quality care services, this shifts some of the unpaid work from the household to the public sphere, to public service provisioning. And this alleviates women's time constraints, helping to increase women's labor supply, and through this supply side channel and decrease their time poverty, improve work-life balance, and through these effects decrease gender equality. So a lot of the discussion on gender care and labor looks at the supply side channel. There's also some work looking at how increased access to quality essential care services enhance health and capabilities of workers, particularly of children, as an investment in human capabilities, decreasing socioeconomic inequalities, and increasing productivity and supply-led growth. So, for instance, work by James Heckman and colleagues is looking at this chain, the supply-side chain. The work that I just mentioned, with the focus on employment creation, is looking at the demand side effects of investment in care services sector. So as the public allocates, public budgets allocate more funds to upgrading and expanding care services sectors, it also becomes a booster of labor demand, because these are labor-intensive sectors with high employment multipliers, so it helps to decrease unemployment, improve labor force participation, and wage incomes. And because these sectors are predominantly female employment intensive, they help to increase demand for women's labor, and through substantial jobs generation, which also means incomes generation, simulations show that they have their impact on poverty alleviation outperforms sectoral spending on other sectors, and they also promote demand-led growth. So one of the simulations entails work that we did on 45 high and medium income countries, most of them in the OECD, but also including countries such as India and China, and looking at how investment, public spending on care services sector, including education, health, and social work, would change if the countries just kept the status quo into 2030, and just simply through demographic change, through increasing population and aging populations particularly, even if the countries kept the same per capita spending, care and employment, we found, would need to increase by another 150 million jobs into 2030. But if those countries took what we call the high road to care, in terms of investing in setting up of universal social care services infrastructure, there would be an additional almost 120 million new jobs generated, making up the care employment up to almost 500 million jobs. And we also estimated that going from the status quo scenario by these 45 countries to the high road to care scenario would require additional spending amounting to 3.5% of their combined GDP. So it's a substantial amount, but justifiable in terms of when we consider the multiple outcomes to care. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna end by saying that an emergence as sort of a new area where a lot of this work is converging towards is looking at the complementarities between the green and the purple economy. So, and the concepts overlap because in the same way that the green economy concept acknowledges that beyond consumption of commodities, market-produced commodities, human well-being and sustainability also depends on access to healthy ecosystems, purple economy, points out, emphasizes how access to quality care, both paid and unpaid family care, is an important component of well-being beyond market consumption. So they both try to account for the value of something that's so invisible in the mainstream framework, the value of nature and the value of care and the value of unpaid care work. The green economy policy framework is organized around internalization of environmental costs into production and consumption patterns. Purple economy, sort of in the four policy pillars, suggests a similar approach is to how to internalize the costs of caring labor into production and consumption patterns. And while green economy is about elimination of intergenerational inequalities, purple economy is about elimination of intersectional inequalities by gender, class, and origin. And both call for a reordering of priorities from GDP growth to nature and nurture to sustainable and equitable increasing growth, including the possibility of degrowth as a policy objective in certain contexts. And finally, a note on further complementarity that purple jobs, which are basically local care services sector jobs, a nurse at a local health clinic, a teacher, a care provider at a local creche, a social worker at a community center. These are jobs, these purple jobs or care jobs are jobs with low emissions. They are local service jobs with low emissions and low waste and output. So in that sense, investing in the purple economy is a strategy for, in the era of AI and digitalization, for job creation that is very much supporting also sustainability objectives of the green economy. Okay, it's at 45 past, and I think I'll stop there. And
thank you, İpek. You were, concluded with a round of applause. I don't know if you heard it from home, but yes, we're all here clapping. I would like, given the fact that I have the microphone, to thank you on behalf of everyone for this very comprehensive and very interesting presentation you gave us on your concept of the purple economy. And also kind of highlight what an ambitious political project that is. I really appreciated the fact that you made no reference, and correct me if I'm wrong, to the welfare state, for example, because what you're proposing is not a reorganization of the welfare state. Neither are we talking about the reintroduction or claiming for gender equality within current labor relation schemes, but rather reorganizing and reconfiguring the economy with a capital E, which I find extremely interesting and pressing and important in this moment. Without further ado, I would give the floor to our discussants, starting with Professor Lombardo. You have 7 minutes. I will let you know.
Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me at this panel, to Guglielmo, Mario, and the team. Thank you, Stella, and thank you especially to İpek for this most wonderful presentation, and especially for this exercise of envisioning. No, this is really a roadmap for how to democratize the economy, how to make it more inclusive, more, people-friendly, more planet-friendly. So I think that in the context, in the sort of gloomy context, political and economic context in which we are living in, I think these kind of exercises are mostly appreciated. I'd like to also clarify that my comments come from a political science background, so I leave the comments, the more economic comments, to my colleagues here in the audience, and I will start first of all. So I will speak about framing, policy practice, factors, and actors in my 7 minutes, 6 now. And so first of all, we know that the meaning of care is quite contested also within feminist theorizing. So if I think of scholars from Nancy Fraser to John Trento, and we had last week Rossella Ciccia here also giving a talk about the different meanings of care. So depending on how we frame it, it also gives us some kind of solutions to the problem. And so, we can have social reproduction, meaning, or care and the welfare state, care economy, social organization of care, or also an ethics of care, the more Tronto and so on. So a first question would be, where do you situate your purple economy framing, or with whom are you in dialogue with, and what insights and limitations do you see also in this conceptualization of the purple economy? My second comment is about policy practice. Of course, I come from gender and public policy. So, I love the vision, but then I think, so how do we put this into practice? So I wonder if you could share some ideas, some experiences of where this purple economy has been put into practice, because it is, as overall, it is a very transformative, comprehensive project. I can think of a couple of examples at the local level of government that put some dimensions, some elements of this purple economy into practice. And I can think of the Barcelona City Council and the Bogota, for example, as being like, they have been defined as two caring cities because they promote this reorganization of care. I mean, I'm more familiar with the Barcelona City Council, but their care, especially in the last period, from the mayorship of Ada Colau, so from 2015 onwards to 2024, it's been defined more as an issue of democratizing, a question of democratization and justice care, but they have also established some governmental programs, also supported by funding. There's the last one is called like Towards the Right to Care, and it's been subsidized by 140.5 million euros throughout 5 years, and some concrete actions to make care a universal entitlement, but also the responsibility of public institutions. So involving market institutions, public institutions, and also men into the reorganization, a more equitative redistribution of care. And another provision that they have done is these clauses of work-life balance. So for companies that want to have public contracts with the Barcelona City Council, they need to introduce measures of work-life balance. So another example is Bogota with the care blocks. So this reorganization of the district system so that caregivers and care receivers receive services from the city council within like 20 minutes distance from where they live. So my question with regard to policy practice would be, is this comprehensive and transformative enough? Or would these kind of reforms be not within the purple economy framework that you think of, and if you have examples of your model? Then I have factors and actors. Do I still have some more minutes? 3 minutes, that's perfect. So factors. And factors, of course, what are the factors that would enable this transformative vision to be put into practice? And so at the macro level, of course, we need a healthy economy, we need a healthy democracy, and at the meso level, we would need governments that make these welfare and care investments. So if we look at the last VDEM report, we see that actually autocracies are increasing. We have 91 autocracies and 88 democracies today in the world, and our liberal democracies are not doing much better. Or well, they're not so healthy, we could say so. And also at the meso level, if I only look at the European Union, I see few governments that are actually doing investments in care. I can think of Nordic countries and the Spanish left-wing government, making paternity and maternity leave equally and fully paid, and also regulating, reducing the work hours from 40 to 37.5 in the case of Spain. It's negotiated. So what potential to make this purple economy happen? And so what enabling factors would you see? And my final point is about actors. You point in your paper, you didn't have much time in the presentation, but in your great paper, you point at the pivotal role of feminist and environmental movements. And it is not a coincidence that reactionary movements are actually attacking them through climate science denialism and anti-gender politics. So can you tell us a little bit more about the effort and the strategies of these actors at the local, at the national, at international level to make these, these more social justice, ecological responsibility and social solidarity plan happen? And also I wonder, what about other movements like trade unions, and what about alliances between these different actors? Thank you so much. It's been most inspiring. So that's where all these comments and questions come from.
Thank you, Emanuela. Giulia?
Good evening. Can you hear me? So thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure. I join Emanuela in thanking all the organizers, Stella, and of course, İpek for this extremely interesting presentation and for the brilliant materials you shared. I would like to start from, I think, one of the first quotes I've ever interacted with concerning care, which was, "Our world is one in which carelessness reigns," which is the first sentence of the Care Manifesto published in 2020 by the Care Collective. And that was a very bleak picture that was being drawn. Of course, we were in a time of deep crisis. İpek, you described the care crisis as something that was, of course, a long time coming, but nothing like the COVID pandemic made it extremely visible. But this visibility that came upon in 2020 was also extremely important because it represented an opportunity to bring this debate that until then has inhabited in more restricted areas to the forefront of the public debate. So what I'm interested in addressing with my comments is what happened with this debate today after 6 years. And I want to do that by focusing on two main key debates that govern our careless society and see how they may relate with what you've been discussing concerning the purple economy and care. And these two debates are one concerning AI and digitalization, and the other one, it's the focus that we're seeing increasingly in our public debate on defense on one side and competitiveness on the other. Starting with the first one, so AI and digitalization, I have to give credit when credit's due. And this is a reflection that was really ignited by a keynote speech held by Esther Lynch, the General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation, in a recent conference in Brussels by ETUI that was discussing exactly this, the future of work in the light of AI and digitalization. And what she was highlighting, and I found very, very interesting, was the fact that it's true that labor markets are being heavily impacted by automation and digitalization through the threat of job losses, but also we've discussed it in the previous panel, the platformization of work that impacts care work, but of course way more sectors than that. But what's very interesting is the shift of perspective, because what was presented by Esther Lynch was also an opportunity for a reconfiguration of economy in the light of care and through the perspective of care. And why is that? Because, of course, we can automate a part of care work, but you cannot fully, hopefully, we'll see, automate the relational and emotional aspects of care work. And this, of course, gives an intrinsic value to care work in an era of AI and digitalization. And the other aspect, which you've also mentioned by talking about the creation of what you defined as an enabling macroeconomic environment, one of the 4 pillars of the purple economy, is the increased focus on job quality, which, as you said, it's very strongly correlated with the debates on care and purple economy. So in light of all of these, I would like to hear your thoughts on the opportunities and risks brought by automation and digitalization to the debate on care and the purple economy. And then shifting to my other comment, I would like to start from another aspect you've already mentioned, which is the connection between the green economy and the purple economy, which I think is part of a broader debate that has been expanding in recent years concerning policies that are pursuing both environmental and social policy goals, because there's a mutual interaction, what you call that complementarity between social and environmental policies. Again, in the previous panel, we were talking about donut economics. And we know that environmental policies have socially differentiated impacts, and social policies have differentiated environmental impacts. So it's very important to see them as a whole. Nonetheless, one key aspect of our contemporaneity is the existence of what we keep hearing as defined as permanent and multiple crises. So the whole discussion about polycrisis and permacrisis that has brought an increased focus on preparedness, defense on one side, and competitiveness on the others, which are, of course, two sides of the same coins. And this promotes what you've defined as a neoliberal agenda that favors, for example, activation vis-a-vis a care perspective. And it's a discourse that's completely disrupting previous, nonetheless, modest achievements that attempted to promote this eco-social model and this green-purple model that's, as you said, was also, among other, promoting a more care-centered perspective. I work on EU policies. One example could be the Just Transition Fund on one side, and then what we're seeing now with the first proposal for the post-2027 multi-annual financial framework that's way more focused again on activation skills and so on and so forth. So I would be interested again to hear your thoughts about how to bring back at the forefront the value of care in a society that's increasingly being dominated by narratives of crisis that are therefore used to justify the complete removal of empathy, we can say, as a cornerstone of our society. Can we use this narrative of crisis to promote instead a more caring perspective through purple economy, or should we completely attempt to go beyond this narrative of crisis? Thank you very much again, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments.
Excellent, thank you both. Now, İpek, if you don't have a problem with that, we would open the floor for the Q&A, maybe for 10-15 minutes before we bring you back in for 10 minutes, so we respect your time restrictions. Is that okay?
It will be a lot of questions piled up, so I'm wondering if I should take a few minutes to answer the comments by Emanuela and Giulia.
Absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, I'm afraid I'm going to lose track of it. The comments by Emanuela and Giulia were so rich that I think just let me take it.
Go ahead, don't you worry.
Okay, all right. So thank you so much for these rich comments. And I'm not sure if I have perfect answers to all of them, but I'm just going to share, my reactions and initial thoughts. So the question of, conceptualizations by, scholars coming not necessarily from an economics background, but from other disciplines such as Nancy Fraser, John Tronto, and the question of who is the idea of the purple economy in conversation with and in what ways. I think my approach, and also all the writings and the ways that the concept of purple economy has been used so far in research and in other works, has been a lot more policy focused, applied work, and I guess approaching a more pragmatic question, at least on my part, as to how to open channels of communication with fiscal policymakers who are in charge of budget allocations, government budget decisions, and how to, communicate with them all the accumulated knowledge and know-how around gender, care, and labor, and how it pertains to their work, and how it pertains to the outcomes of the types of budget allocation decisions, public spending and public investment decisions that they make. So that's a very pragmatic question, and it is one that I encountered in my context, because when we were doing in the early 2000s, all the advocacy for, like the types of care policies we needed to improve women's employment and eliminate the gender wage gap in the Turkish context primarily, that's where I was working primarily. We convinced the Ministry for Labor, we convinced the Ministry for Women and Social Policy. They were like entirely convinced that, this is where, we needed to go towards like better care policies, work-life reconciliation, etc. And then we got the block from the Ministry for Economy and the Treasury. And they said, oh, this is a luxury. Yeah, we understand all your comments, concerns about, improving women's employment, and we'd like to do the same. We have nothing against it, but it's a luxury for the Turkish economy. Our main problem is unemployment now. Our main problem is decreasing the youth unemployment rate and the overall unemployment rate, and and improving the growth rate, and this issue of providing childcare services, expanding childcare centers, it's not a priority for us. And that was the point when we started thinking about the fiscal aspects of of our advocacy and macroeconomic policy making. And same thing with the issue, as we all know, feminists have been very much, supportive of, the ecological advocacy and advocacy for, environmentalist policies. without, reciprocation at an equal level of the, advocates for ecological health, supporting the feminine advocacy for gender equality in the economy. So another way I was trying to, another, area of communication that we've been pushing is how to make people working on the green economy realize that purple is an undeniably important and core component of the green policy agenda, not an add-on, but like they're like completely interlinked. And I think feminist work has done a lot of progress on that front. In terms of the Emanuela, the examples you gave of the Barcelona City Council, Bogota care blocks, yeah, absolutely. This is the kind of policy, concrete policy examples that a purple economy policy framework would envision. But is it sufficient? I think, looking at the 4 pillars in a very integrated manner. So like the Bogota care blocks, it's about, for instance, service provisioning to alleviate indirect care work and direct care work by women family caregivers. I love the innovation in that. But at the same time, my main criticism of the Bogota care blocks would be that it is too much of an approach from the perspective of women's unpaid caregiving, without enough emphasis on the care needs by children, by the elderly, by the people with disabilities. Like when we hear or read about Bogota care blocks, it's all about how it impacts women's role as caregivers, but we don't hear anything about how it improves the well-being of the children who go to the child care centers or the elderly, people with disabilities who go to the community centers or eat at the community kitchen at the care blocks. So I feel it misses those simultaneous perspectives or caregivers and care receivers. And also, like the question of, providing women with access to decent jobs, employment opportunities, also, how to regulate the labor market for better, redistribution of the family care work within the household between women and men, like that's something that needs to complement. But that simultaneous perspective of caregivers and care receivers is very important in my response to your final question on what is the potential to make a purple economy in a context of 90 plus autocracies and only around 80 democracies, like in this current, political and social transformation. I think in addition to feminist and environmentalist movements, I would add the progressive economics or macroeconomics movements, the heterodox macro movement with its emphasis on better jobs, more jobs, good jobs economy, full employment, and the potential, therefore, of care services sectors to serve as a very important source of new jobs into the future, both for women and men, as an important strategy for advocacy, because this is where will the jobs come from is the concern of everyone, whether you're an autocracy, democracy, conservative, progressive, men, women, doesn't matter. And also the perspectives of care receivers from the care receiving end, particularly in aging societies with the improved life expectancy, a true concrete problem, social problem, an economic problem that we have is how to address the needs of, for instance, people with dementia, Alzheimer's, people with Parkinson's, like with all these not new, but diseases that are becoming almost like epidemics, affecting not only the people with the disease, but also their immediate environment, their families, their family caregivers, their paid caregivers. And in many contexts, there's absolutely no system to address these multiple needs by paid caregivers, family caregivers, by the people with the illness. Everybody has to reinvent the wheel in their own private sphere as to how to deal with the case of having somebody now developing dementia in their household, or Parkinson's, whatever. And also, coming to the children with learning challenges, with ADD, which has becoming an increasing prevalence amongst children and youth, particularly in the post-COVID era. So there is this massive care need, accumulation of multiple diverse needs on the care receiving side, which the policymakers are blind to. And this is not only affecting women and, deteriorating gender equality, but it is also affecting, both women and men caregivers and people who are, suffering from the conditions. So it's a huge burden. Whereas it can be addressed from a systematic perspective. So I think that getting all this, the advocacy from the care receiving side, I think will be a very strong advocacy point. And there's also the issue of how, the solution to the demographic crisis, if there is one, that we should discuss from a green and purple perspective, of course, but whether that will be met by simply cash transfers for childbirth and to families and so on. And finally, coming to Julia's question on AI and digitalization, I think that's where it's a developing, very fertile area for future work, thinking, and research. Julia, it's very important, and I am on the optimistic side. I think AI and digitalization has an immense potential for upgrading care services provisioning, for improving the well-being of care receivers, particularly the elderly and people with illnesses, with chronic illnesses, and also the well-being of caregivers by complementing their work. And I think that's a huge area of innovation, how to make AI and digitalization, AI and digital technologies work from a human-centered care and gender equal and human-centered care approach. I think it's one of the next frontiers of research and applied innovation facing us. I think I've answered.
We can move on, just because we're limited by time. Otherwise, we could carry on forever. Thank you for your comments. They have already started a wonderful discussion, it seems. Now we have about, let's say, 10 minutes to collect questions. Mario first. Do we have microphones in the...
Let's see if it's working, because the other day it seems to be working.
Okay.
You want to try with this?
Thank you so much, İpek. A very quick question. I like very much your framework, but besides the dynamics between the household-centered social reproduction activities on the one hand and the market production dynamics on the other hand, seems to me that needs to be complemented by a third sphere, which is the provision of public welfare state services, because the importance of the innovative contribution of the welfare state is that you assert a universal right on a political ground to citizens, and you provide an infrastructure that you mentioned later, but an infrastructure where you have public resources collected through taxation, providing jobs which are good public sector job, therefore not dominated by capital labor relationships, and where the quality and quantity of the services that are provided are socially decided. For instance, picking up your last point, what are the problems that we have to address with care policies? There are infinite needs, but we need a political decision and a socially shared decision on what are the needs that we need to address with policies. So I think adding this third box from your early picture would help us recover both the space for politics and a sphere where the nature of jobs are structurally less commodified and less vulnerable to the labor market stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Anyone else? I think Gabriele has the mic. Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see you. Could you also introduce yourself once you get the microphone?
Thank you. I'm a PhD student from the University of Bari. Thanks for the presentation, which I found really interesting. And my research interests are in labor market institutions and in particular how collective bargaining promotes gender equality. So as I saw from your works, I was wondering, since the purple economy offers a proposal for a comprehensive transformation of the economic paradigm, I was going to ask what concrete measures do you think are effective in order to prevent and to reduce gender stratification, aside from the valorization of care work, and to prevent the horizontal
I'm sorry, the
segregation.
Your voice is cracking in the middle, so I didn't get the last part of the question. Maybe speak a little bit farther away from the mic. I'm not sure what the problem is.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Okay, I was saying, what concrete measure do you consider effective in order to break the vicious cycle of gender stratification, apart from the valorization of care work and care economy? And also, how do you think social cultural change in labor markets can happen and can be promoted so that parental and career leaves and flexibility cannot be used in a discriminatory manner on workplaces? So thank you.
So we have another one, hopefully this time.
Oops. Cool system. Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I really valued hearing your ideas about a practical proposal that we could actually, it seems like we could do it now. I really like the trajectory and feeling like we actually have some solutions in these spaces. It can feel like we're doing so many critiques and there isn't really an actual idea of how we change things. So thank you so much for this. But while I was listening, obviously the critiques were coming in my head. And so I would love to hear your response to them so I can get back onto the optimistic bandwagon and feel like, you know, we're still going to do this. I guess my first question is about who do we see picking up the paid care jobs in your model? If it's any replica of what we see now, where it's mostly migrant labor or like Black and brown people around the world carrying the survival of our entire care system. How do you see in the future of this model avoiding replicating class and race inequalities in the purple economy? And then secondly, I like your idea of proposing to the green economy that if we free up maybe mostly skilled women to
if we paid care labor to free up their time so that they could work in jobs for the green economy in the era of AI and digitalization, as you said, how do we ensure we aren't just moving these women from caring for humans to now caring for the environment and nature? And what could be some of the future limitations of kind of this kind of proposal and kind of, I guess, future problems that we might sit at a conference like this in like 50 years time and be discussing maybe the exact same thing when we place the burden of care just on a different group of people, but this time onto the care of our entire environment, which again, all humans rely on. So thank you so much.
Excellent.
I say that with all love and respect, because I do want to know the solutions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So unless there is any pressing questions, I would suggest that we allow İpek to respond with sufficient time. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all these comments and questions. In response to Mario's question, the third sphere that was missing from the early part of the presentation. Yes, absolutely. I think the way I structured it is because that first part is talking about the evolution of conceptual thinking. And I guess I should have, it would make sense now that I'm thinking, and maybe I will try working on a new slide, bringing in the third sphere, the public sphere, as you know, an addition to the way that the conceptual thinking has developed, and you know, ideas the work by, for instance, Nancy Fraser on care and the welfare state and so on actually does fit in that third sphere. But by the way, I should also mention that when I talk about purple jobs, I don't envision that necessarily they all need to be public care services provisioning jobs. I mean, what evidence or some analysis is showing that even the people are willing to pay, have ability and willingness to pay for certain types of care services, without state involvement or without the involvement of a central planner to kick off the sector and to kick off the various, you know, development of various types of skills, those services are not innovated and are not offered even when people have the willingness and the ability to pay. But definitely that's an area for the public sphere to kick off and to regulate. The second question, I think, was it a student from from Bard College? I'm not sure. I think the question was about concrete measures to break vicious cycles of gender stratification other than care economy measures. The whole gender division of labor between paid and unpaid work and the gender division of labor around care provisioning, family care provisioning, I think is very much lies at the source of the gender gaps that gender stratifications that we see in the public sphere, whether it's the market economy or decision making or gender roles. So my take is that, you know, addressing the gender division of care and care work and care responsibilities is a major intervention towards gender equality that has the potential to kick off you know, multiple effects on other areas as well, but obviously you know, gender, a very important area of gender stratification or gender inequality is violence against women and gender violence. So that requires a sort of a different interlinked but different framework. And in terms of labor market regulations to promote gender equality, there is quite a bit of work in some of the, for instance, northern countries and increasingly now in also other countries as to how to design, for instance, parental leave or care leave policy so that the take-up rates by men and women converge and become equal. But I think there's a lot of scope to work on how to design labor market policies and regulations and work-life incentives, policies in a way that promote gender equality outcomes. And the shorter working week, the advocacy for a shorter working week, for instance, although it doesn't, look at gender equality policy, it's sort of a more neutral policy, and very much picked up and supported by Gen Z, I think also is likely to have, as a labor market policy, gender equality outcomes as well. And the last question on who is likely to pick up the care jobs, the idea, because of limitations of time, I didn't use the last couple of slides, but I think a future area of focus needs to be on how to upskill and upgrade care services jobs and innovate new types of expert care services depending on the diversity of care needs. I think there's a lot of potential for their upgrading, skills upgrading, and improving their productivity, particularly also using the new technologies around AI and digitalization, so that care jobs do not remain, areas of work that are with low productivity, that are foreseen or where our concept of productivity changes, transforms in terms of the quality of the services that are produced, not necessarily the time it takes them to produce them. So it's basically upgrading and upgrading the care services sectors and promoting them as an area of new service innovation. So I think this would be the way to avoid replicating intersectional inequalities that we see, particularly in areas of care work. And I think that the minute you say that we're thinking of domestic workers and maybe long-term care workers and childcare workers, but the way we define care services sectors is much wider, and long-term care workers, domestic workers, and childcare workers need to become more integrated in this wider definition, framing of care services sectors. I think I've answered all. And there was a question on limitation of women participating in green economy. I don't think I got that question exactly. Am I hearing you, or if somebody is speaking, I'm not hearing?
Sorry, yeah, we're clarifying between us.
Okay.
So if we are moving, yeah. Why don't you come and you do it? Yeah.
No, I was helping. You might have already answered it, but it was just about if we're using the language of moving women mostly from the purple economy as a form of gender equality to move them into the green economy in the idea of like AI and digitalization, where they have loads of jobs, etc. And we're saying that they're now going to care for the environment and our planet. Are we at risk of replicating the same structure? And acknowledging that policies we make now will affect future generations, could it be that people sat here in 50 or 100 years and are now talking about how like women are burdened with caring for the planet and the environment yet again? Thank you.
Yeah, the idea is having equal representation of women and men in the purple sector and in the green sector, caring for human beings, for communities, for the planet and the environment. And through that, set of policies in an integrated framework, through a transformative care and green agenda.
All right. Well, thank you, İpek. I understand that our time finishes now. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us and your thoughts and your research and your proposals. It has been extremely interesting for all of us. If we can get a final round of applause for İpek before we salute her. Thank you very much, and we hope that in the next spring school you'll be here with us physically also.
I hope so too. Thank you very much, and thank you for excellent comments and questions.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Exactly. And now we have an hour. I mean, we don't have a main speaker, but we do have each other and the room for another hour. So any further questions, debates, we can have a casual conversation among us using microphones that don't work very well. So, the floor is communal.
Yeah, no, I just had a question that concerns, let's say, investing in care jobs and like the care economy that leads in the direction of further servitization of the economy. So servitization of the economy. So in a way, especially in the heterodox literature, there is a claim, a general claim that further servitization of the economy slow down dynamic processes of accumulation, like positive accumulation of capital. So I wonder if only those countries who have managed to secure a very strong structural position in tangible production of capital will manage to invest in the care economy. So leaving out, indeed, the entire periphery. So if this is, again, will be a process of core periphery divergence, but in the care economy. Thank you.
Take a question by Guglielmo.
Yes, it's a question to myself or to everybody. It's not to anybody specifically. Apart from the fact, of course, that if we finish a little bit before 6:30, we do a little bit less production, and then we have a little bit more time for sleeping and for social reproduction. It's not too bad. I just want to say, for those who are more on the labor side, I'm editing a special issue that I'm helping editing a special issue which will come out very soon in the European Journal of Industrial Relations on this area, more or less, that is on the care jobs and on the role that industrial relations may have to promote better jobs and better services. So I must say, it presents research from around Europe. The main editors are colleagues in Milan, Amorosi and Emanuela Pavolini. I must say that the paper, for how they're coming out, are a little bit less inspiring and positive than the lecture I've just listened to. That is, in the current practice, we are still quite far away from this idea of purple economy. Unfortunately, I have to, the evidence is there because the problem of care is mostly presented through the so-called trilemma that you have to meet the budget constraints because nobody wants to pay tax. You have to provide good jobs in theory, and you have to provide more and more services because more and more we need childcare. There's more demand for childcare, even if there are fewer children, there's more demand, and especially there is much more demand for long-term care and other forms of care. It's impossible to have all three. You can't save money, have good jobs, and increase the services. The interesting bit I found of this lecture is that it proposes to go beyond this trilemma by saying another way of having the economy that can be sustainable in the long term and be better without this fiscal constraint, big threat. Something positive is happening, I would say, in the fact that is in this debate in industrial relations and care, an argument is used more and more is the fact of not labeling care as a cost, which is the big problem. So that seems to have moved forward in the last few years. Then maybe that is a positive change. It's all used more and more by obviously the unions, by also policymakers. In a way, it has become something, a little bit of a slogan everybody accepts. Whether they actually mean it or not, I'm not 100% sure. A little bit, that special issue compares the care for children, this early early care, how do you call it? Or early education, early, anyway, care for small children, and long-term care, mostly for the elderly, childhood education care. And they see that this idea of investment, in a way, when we talk about children, people push it a little bit more. And when they talk about long-term care, because obviously everybody understands, and there is also the middle-class demands for better service for children, it's not that positive, the trend with long-term care, and the idea of being, an investment that can improve life everywhere and everybody and so on. But something is moving also in that direction. So it's a topic that is now entering finally also the study of labor relations.
And now it would be fair to ask the discussions to respond or make comments, but we're going to do it in a more DIY fashion. I think Giulia has something to say.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a thing to share, which is like, I don't know, it's again a question for myself, for everyone, and probably it has no answer, but I do see some contradictions there, like in the current economic system, because I do see a contradiction between, I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. At the end of the day, if the cake is of the same shape, we need to divide it in some ways. And these can be overcome if we pursue growth. And so we continue to expand the cake. But at the end of the day, we realized, and I think it's clear to everyone, that we cannot expand the cake anymore. I mean, there's no space, or there's space in limited things, but there's no space for really expanding the cake in order to continue expanding the privilege of sharing it in an equal way. So, and I do see a contradiction between these and the fact of investing, because it may create a different way of consuming, and different way of consuming can mean having to produce in order to meet those consumptions, and go on in this way. And so, like, my question for myself, for everyone, and probably no answer, is, do we really can we really solve these contradictions between the one between full employment and overconsumption, the one between growth and inequality and the limited resources and the constraints given not only from the budget but also from the environment, and clearly the earth is giving us signals, and it's clearly like we are facing a situation of, I mean, we're going into war, so careless, extreme careless society, to mention the way the amazing quotation Giulia shared with us. Can we really solve these within the current economic system? Is this something that can be fixed, or are we just, I don't know. Yeah, that's the question. Sorry for sharing it.
Thank you, Giulia. Can I ask if there's any reactions? No. Let's do Emanuela, and then.
Yeah, no, just to react to your first comment about the servitization of economy and the periphery. I think here it connects with the discussion about the platform economy, and there I would say we had another panel before about intersectionality, and I think we need to consider, when we address this issue, then what are the different intersections of class and gender and race that go on. So we cannot, we need, as the talk was telling us, we need a more comprehensive view. We cannot just address one domain, and we cannot just ignore the intersecting inequality that you were rightly mentioning about the periphery. So yes, I think that's very relevant. And then, yeah, I don't know, I don't have a, I mean, I can say, well, again, the question is the capitalist system of domination, but how it is intersecting with other systems, no, and with patriarchy, as İpek was saying, but also colonialism and the issue of climate change. So again, I think it was very relevant, this talk, because it also helped us to see the broader picture that sometimes we see all the labor and the patriarchy and all this. But I think it was really, really helpful in this respect.
If I may also add something, but if you want to go first, please do. Okay, thank you so much. I'm afraid I do not have the competencies to answer your question. I'm sorry. So I will not even try. I think Guglielmo mentioned something concerning the different trends we are looking at when we look at early education and childhood care and long-term care. But I think that's a general trend we're seeing because like policy-wise, they are being addressed in a very different way in the sense that with early childhood care, we are looking at a tendency to institutionalize this kind of care. So the Italian example with the NNRP, there was this very big and failed attempt to build a lot of nurseries, So we want to take the kids out of their mothers, unfortunately, responsibility so that the mothers can go to work. This is the whole social investment discussion that the EU is really, really pushing over the last few years. And the opposite is true for long-term care. We want elderly people to be independent as long as possible and not in institutions because institutions are expensive. So there's really this different trend going on, and it's being pursued quite systematically. So I'm not surprised that the observation, there are different observations coming from these two phenomena because are being addressed differently from a policy level, at least from my understanding. Concerning Giulia's huge question, I of course don't have an answer also here, but I think what's very interesting is that over the last few years, we've seen a lot of discussions about transitions, the green transition, the digital transition, and so on and so forth, which I think it's a very soft understanding, of the necessity of one last big investment, to transition our society towards something different, because the current model, as you said, is really not sustainable. And so there is this very interesting approach, I would say, of understanding that, trying to find solutions, but not being brave enough to completely question the current system. So that's, again, I do work on EU policy, and you really do see that with various attempts to be ambitious and then making one step forwards and two backs, It's a bit disheartening. I don't know what's the way forward, but I think there is some very, very light understanding of that. In the back of the mind of policymakers, there are some questions emerging, I think. Will it be enough? I don't think so, but we were keeping an optimistic trend, so maybe let's just end it here. And actually, I wanted to add something. I didn't get your name, sorry. Amelia. I had something to say about your question from before to İpek, because when you asked how do we ensure that we do not reproduce current inequalities in future jobs, I really like that framework that was proposed by Adati and others in a report by ILO in 2019, which discusses what they call, and it's quite a mouthful, but unpaid work, paid care work cycle. So the relationship between unpaid care work, paid care work, and paid work, how all of the three interact and how we can act on each side of this triangle to ensure that these negative impacts that there are currently are improved. And it starts from, first of all, recognizing the existence of unpaid care work, reducing and redistributing it. And this will allow also to the better understanding and recognition of unpaid care work will also have positive externalities on paid care work, allowing better rewards, so better wages and better representation. And this will allow
care work, paid care work, and unpaid care work not to be second level, second tier sort of jobs, no? So it won't be the kind of jobs that bring the workers into reinforcing their marginalized role. I don't know if this answered this question, but I think it really relies on giving dignity to care work. So making care work as important as, I don't know, what's nowadays are very well rewarded sort of jobs. But you wanted to ask some questions. So. Yeah.
I don't know if it's really the place now to have this introduction. It's already a bit late. So I think we all want to start some social reproduction activities, but I think I would place the care within a broader picture. I mean, I like the work around gender regime theory, so I don't think that care can be addressed only as, you know, something that is isolated, but we need to look at it within the broader society that is, you know, gendered, but that is reproduced in several domains. So it deals with economy, but also polity, but also violence, civil society, and the knowledge. So for me, this is it's not something that can be addressed in isolation from considering all these other domains and taking into account intersecting inequalities. So that I share that with you. And if you want, we can talk about, you know, what I research on maybe over the coffee if you does. But yes, I work on democracy and feminism right now. And public policies, gender equality policies. It does, in the sense that, you know, care is part. So if we want to democratize society, then of course we need to democratize care and to make the you know, care work more redistributed and to make society more caring and more inclusive in all respects. So I think, you know, this care is part of achieving a more democratic society in terms.
but if I may fit into this, sorry, I cannot see you. What's your name? Sorry. Nicola. I think it's a very interesting point, but I wonder, it's not my area of expertise. I would love to hear your thoughts about this, how the whole war economy fits into this, though, because we are getting into a phase, okay, we can look at this perspective you were mentioning, which works for us, because us being the countries that are not currently being faced with this growing conflict, no? But we live in an era where conflict is everywhere, and this has economic and environmental impacts that are growing more and more and more. So is it generalizable, this discussion, or does this war economy that's becoming preponderant makes these claims null and void?
Just a comment on this. We see that there are new technologies, of course, but there are old socioeconomic trends that continues to go away with this. So, I mean, society is becoming increasingly unequal, also in the case in which we are able to create a sustainable society in terms of production and CO2 emissions. The shape of the cake will be more and more, if the trends, I mean, turned in the future, we will go towards more unequal societies, and also will this will create many problems also in terms of the values reproduction that have been society. I mean, care is just a dimension of what society evaluates as good and for us all. Nowadays, we see that we are much more on to profits, and so that social reproduction that. But for the technical part, of course, we are making a lot of.
Right. I think we have identified some hot topics for discussion in the great outdoors. I think we can dissolve the formal meeting here and take it outside and talk to our debate buddies. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. Thank you particularly to our discussants, Emanuela and Giulia, and to İpek, who is no longer here. So thank you.